Orson Crowell slammed his fist on the kitchen table so hard the tin cups rattled off the edge and hit the floor. "You don't get a penny," he snarled, his face red as a cattle brand. "You never did a single thing around here that earned you a cent." Tamsin stood 3 feet away, her hands still dusted with flour, and she didn't flinch. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd been flinching her whole life and had finally gotten tired of it. She was 41 years old. She had buried her dignity in this kitchen, meal by meal, year by year, and the man across the table from her had been the one holding the shovel. What happened in the next 60 seconds would either break her completely or begin something neither of them could have predicted. If this were your life, your labor, your years, your silence, what would you have done in that moment? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something real in you, something you've carried quietly for years, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. We tell stories that don't get told anywhere else. Drop a comment right now and tell me, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now, let's go back to that kitchen. Let's go back to Tamsin. The argument had started, as most arguments in that house did, over something small. Tamsin had asked, quietly, the way she always asked, the way a person learns to ask when they've been refused enough times, whether she might be paid for the 3 weeks of harvest cooking she'd done in September. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even really a question. It was more like a sound a person makes when they're testing whether a door is still locked. Orson Crowell looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has just had the nerve to speak. "Paid." He repeated the word like it tasted wrong. "You want to be paid." "I cooked for 14 men 3 times a day for 22 days, Tamsin said. "I want what we agreed on." That was the problem, of course. They hadn't agreed on anything, not in writing, not in any form that could be held in a hand or shown to a judge. It had been understood, or rather, Tamsin had understood one thing, and Orson had understood another, and the difference between those two understandings was the entire shape of her life at Red Creek. Orson pushed back from the table. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with hands that had done real work once, and now mostly gestured at the work other people did. He had a way of filling a room that wasn't about his size so much as his certainty. The absolute, unquestioned conviction that every room he entered belonged to him. "You live here," he said. "You eat here. You sleep in a bed that I provide. You want to talk about what's owed? Let's talk about what you owe." Tamsin set down the bowl she was holding. Not hard. She just set it down. She had done the math many times, in the quiet hours before anyone else was awake, when the kitchen belonged to her alone and she could think without someone watching. She had lived at her cousin's ranch for 11 years. She had cooked, cleaned, mended, nursed the sick, helped with calving in the cold black mornings of February, sat up all night with Orson's youngest when the boy had the croup. She had done every piece of that without complaint, largely because complaining had never once changed anything. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. That was what Orson had told her when she arrived. Thin and humiliated and carrying almost nothing, after her marriage had collapsed in the particular way that leaves a woman not just alone but marked. Temporary, he had said, just until you get on your feet. 11 years later, Tamsin's feet were still on Orson Crowell's floor, and Orson had stopped pretending there was any other arrangement possible. "I'm not arguing with you about this," she said. "Good," Orson said, "because there's nothing to argue about. I'm leaving." The room changed. It wasn't dramatic. Tamsin hadn't raised her voice, hadn't thrown anything, hadn't done any of the things a person in a story might do to signal that something important was happening. She'd just said 2 words in the same flat, tired tone she used for everything, and somehow those 2 words landed in the kitchen like a stone through a window. Orson stared at her. "Leaving. I'm going to find work somewhere that pays. And who's going to have you?" He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather. Matter of fact. Settled. "You're 41 years old, Tamsin. You've got a reputation that follows you whether you deserve it or not. You've got no money and no references I'd give you, and nowhere to go that's going to be better than here." She knew he believed that. She also knew, standing there with flour on her hands and a cracked bowl on the table between them, that he might be right. That was the part that made her throat tight. Not his cruelty, but the possibility that his cruelty was accurate. She picked up the bowl anyway. "Then I'll find out," she said. She had come to Orson's ranch in the winter of 1882, and the story she carried with her was the kind that attaches itself to a woman and never quite lets go. At 19, Tamsin had married a man named Cole Prentice, who was charming and restless and had a smile that made a room warmer. She had loved him with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a person who has not yet learned that certainty is not the same as safety. They had been married 8 months when a woman appeared at the door of their rented house in Faro County, a woman with 2 small children and a legal document and an expression on her face that Tamsin would never forget, because it was the expression of a person who has been wronged so many times they have stopped being surprised. Cole Prentice already had a wife, had one when he married Tamsin, had one when he charmed her, when he kissed her, when he stood in front of a preacher and spoke words that, as it turned out, were legally meaningless because they were the second time he'd spoken them. He disappeared 2 days later, left both women with nothing. Tamsin's family had tried to absorb the scandal, but scandal in a small community is like water. It finds every crack, seeps into everything, and the stain it leaves isn't always where the original damage was. People were kind to her face and talked behind her back, and after a few years of that, she had moved to the next county, and then the one after that, and eventually ended up at Orson's door because Orson was the only family she had left who would take her in. She hadn't expected gratitude. She had expected in some vague way that being family meant something. She learned slowly that for Orson, family was a word that described a particular kind of arrangement, one where Tamsin owed and Orson received, and the debt somehow never got smaller. The rumors about her had followed her to Ironwill Basin in the softened, smudged form that rumors take when they travel. Nobody knew quite what had happened, only that something had, only that she wasn't quite right, only that there was a reason a woman that age was living in her cousin's house doing kitchen work instead of having a life of her own. People filled in the blanks with whatever their imagination suggested, and imagination in a small community tends toward the unkind. Tamsin had learned not to fight it. Fighting made it worse. She had also learned, painfully, that silence was sometimes mistaken for confirmation. So she cooked, she baked. She kept to herself. She kept her family's sourdough starter alive in a small crock on the back of the shelf, feeding it every morning the way her grandmother had taught her mother and her mother had taught her. A cup of flour, a half cup of water, a stir to wake it up. It was a silly thing to be attached to, she sometimes thought, a jar of fermenting dough that needed tending like a small animal. But it had come west in a wagon 40 years before her grandmother's family arrived in this valley, and it had survived things that hadn't been designed to survive. And when Tamsin held it, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a kind of continuity, a thread running backward through time to hands she had never known, but that had been like hers. She was not sentimental about much. She was sentimental about the crock. She didn't leave that night. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and listened to the windwork at the corner of the house, and she thought about what Orson had said. "Who's going to have you?" The words were designed to shrink her down to a manageable size, and the terrible thing about words designed to do that is that they sometimes work even when you can see the machinery inside them. Tamsin was not stupid. She knew Orson had said that because he was afraid of losing his cook, not because it was necessarily true. She knew the difference between a man speaking truth and a man trying to hold on to something. But she was 41 years old, and there was a difference between knowing something in your mind and feeling it somewhere deeper. And somewhere deeper she had begun to believe that she had already lived the best parts of her life without noticing, and that what remained was a long, slow diminishing toward a death that would inconvenience very few people. She sat with that thought for a while. She didn't cry. She had cried about her situation, really cried, the kind of crying that leaves you hollowed out, maybe twice in the last decade. It seemed wasteful now, like pouring water onto ground that didn't absorb it. She thought instead about the morning. She would have to be in the kitchen before 5. There were 3 ranch hands who left early for the east pasture and needed food before the cold got into their bones, and Orson would want his coffee exactly as he always wanted it, and the sourdough starter needed to be fed. Whatever she decided about leaving, those things would still need doing tomorrow morning. She lay back on the bed without taking off her boots, which was something she almost never allowed herself because it struck her as giving up. She was asleep in 4 minutes. The man who would change everything had been watching her for longer than she knew. Garrick Vale was 53 years old and owned the largest cattle operation in Ironwill Basin and the surrounding territory, Red Mesa Ranch, which ran 1,200 head of cattle across land that had taken him 20 years of difficult work to build into something worth keeping. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not charming in the way that Cole Prentice had been charming, that easy brightness that could fill a room. He was the other kind of man entirely, the kind who says fewer things but means them, who pays attention when other people talk, who notices details that most people miss because they're too busy making noise. He had noticed Tamsin Crowell 8 months before their story truly began. His wife Clara had been dying slowly from a sickness that the doctor in Ironwill Basin couldn't quite name and couldn't fix. And in the last months of that dying, Tamsin had come twice a week to help, not because anyone had asked her, not because Garrick had sought her out specifically, but because Tamsin was the kind of woman who showed up when people were suffering, even when those people hadn't been particularly kind to her. She had shown up with food, mostly. Simple things: broth, bread, a jar of preserves that Clara had particularly liked. But she had also shown up with something harder to name, a quality of presence, a stillness, that made a sick room feel less like a place where something was being lost, and more like a place where something was being witnessed. She didn't pretend Clara wasn't dying. She didn't fill the silence with cheerful nonsense. She sat, and she listened, and when Clara wanted to talk, she talked, and when Clara didn't, she simply kept her company. Garrick had stood in the doorway once, watching without being seen. He had watched Tamsin hold his wife's hand while Clara slept, and something about the way Tamsin did it, no performance in it, nobody watching her, just her sitting in a wooden chair holding a sleeping woman's hand, had told him something about who this woman was that all the stories in the valley couldn't touch. Clara died on a Tuesday morning in late March, with her children beside her and her husband holding her other hand. And after the burial, Garrick had gone back to the ranch and done what men like him do with grief. He worked. He worked until his body was too tired to let his mind say anything, and then he slept, and then he got up and worked again. His daughter Lenora took over the house with a fierce, brittle efficiency that was her own version of the same thing. His son Silas disappeared into the barn, where the horses didn't ask anything of you and didn't require you to be okay. Garrick thought about Tamsin Crowell sometimes, in the way you think about a piece of music you heard through a window, something you didn't hear completely, something you couldn't quite reconstruct, but that stayed in you anyway. He saw her in town occasionally. He noticed how people spoke to her, or rather how they didn't. The particular variety of social silence that falls around a woman who has been decided about. He noticed how she accepted it, not with bitterness, but with a kind of practiced endurance, the way a person walks through rain because standing still doesn't help. He had not intended to do what he did on the evening of the first hard frost. He had come to Orson Crowell's ranch on ordinary business, a dispute about a property line that had been simmering for 2 seasons and needed to be settled before winter made it irrelevant. He had found Orson in the yard, in a bad mood about something, and they had discussed the property line, and he had been turning his horse to leave when he heard, not words exactly, but the shape of words through the kitchen window, the particular rhythm of a man saying something to someone he believes cannot answer back. He sat on his horse and listened. He heard Orson's voice, low and satisfied with itself. He heard a woman's voice, quieter but steady. He couldn't make out what was being said, but he understood the shape of it, the way you understand the shape of a thing through cloth, the weight of it, the sharp edges. He should have ridden home. Instead, he tied his horse to the post and walked around to the kitchen door and knocked. Tamsin opened the door and looked at him. She was holding a dish towel. Her hair was escaping from its pins in the way it always did by evening, several dark strands she would never manage to keep contained. She had flour on the left side of her jaw, and she didn't know it. She looked tired in the way that suggests not just this evening, but many evenings. She looked at him with absolutely no expression of surprise. That was the first thing he noticed, that she looked at a man like Garrick Vale appearing at her kitchen door with the same face she would have turned toward a delivery of firewood. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Miss Crowell." He hesitated. He was not a man who hesitated often. "I heard some of what was being said inside." Tamsin looked at him. Her expression didn't change. "Then you've had your entertainment for the evening," she said, and started to close the door. "I didn't come to offer you sympathy," he said quickly. She stopped, looked at him again. Sympathy's cheap, he said. I know that. I'm not here to give you something cheap. He wasn't sure what he was there to give her. He had knocked on the door before he'd worked that out, and standing on the step in the dark with the cold beginning to settle around both of them, he was figuring it out as he spoke, which was not his natural way. I watched you with my wife, he said. Those last months. I watched how you were with her. Tamsin said nothing. Her hand still held the door, but she had stopped closing it. Clara told me about you, Garrick said. Not stories. What she told me about you isn't what this valley talks about. She told me what she saw. I was just a person sitting with her, Tamsin said. That's not nothing, he said. There was a long pause in which the wind moved between them, and neither of them moved. I'd like to call on you, Garrick said. I'd like permission to call on you properly. Tamsin looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that was hard to read. Not disbelief exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has learned that things which look like good fortune generally aren't, and is reviewing the evidence. Mr. Vale, she said, I'm a 41-year-old woman with a ruined reputation and a cousin who just told me nobody would take me in. I'd be grateful if you would not play games with me. I don't have the patience for it anymore. I'm not playing anything, he said. Men like you don't court women like me. I'm asking, he said, not explaining the logic of it. Another long pause. I don't know you well enough, she said finally. That's what calling on someone is for. I don't know your intentions. My intentions are to know you better and to see where that goes. I'm 53 years old and I've buried the person I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. I'm not interested in games either. She studied him. He let her. All right, she said at last. You can call on me. And then, because she was Tamsin, she added, on one condition. He waited. If you mean it, if this is serious and not curiosity, then ask me somewhere that people can hear, not at Orson's kitchen door in the dark, out in the open, where I can know you're not ashamed of it. He nodded. I can do that. She looked at him one more time, and then she closed the door, and he stood on the step for a moment in the cold and the dark before walking back to his horse. He was smiling, which surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time something had surprised him into smiling. The next 10 days were strange ones for Tamsin. She had told no one. She had no one to tell, really. No close friend in the valley, no sister she could write to. She carried the conversation around inside herself like something fragile, taking it out occasionally to examine it, and then putting it carefully away before she broke it by thinking about it too hard. She knew what the valley would say, if they knew. She knew the theory that would develop. Garrick Vale has lost his mind with grief. He doesn't know what he's doing. Give it a month, and he'll see sense. She had even considered that theory herself, in the small, honest hours before dawn when she was being rigorous with her own hopes. But she had looked at him on the step in the dark, and she had 22 years of reading people quickly and accurately because, in her situation, you could not afford to be wrong about a person's character. And what she had seen in Garrick Vale was not pity and was not curiosity and was not grief turning toward the wrong thing. She wasn't sure what it was, but it wasn't any of those things. She fed her sourdough starter every morning and baked the bread and cooked the meals and endured Orson's pointed silences because he knew something had shifted, could feel it the way animals feel weather, even though he didn't know what. And she waited. Garrick Vale came into town on the following Saturday for Supply Day, which was ordinary enough. He came most Saturdays. What was not ordinary was that he walked directly to where Tamsin was standing outside the dry goods store, in front of half the permanent population of Ironwill Basin, and he removed his hat. The hat removal was what stopped conversations. Men in this valley did not remove their hats for ordinary interactions. They removed their hats when they entered a church, when they passed a coffin, and when they were standing before a woman in a particular kind of seriousness. Tamsin went very still. Miss Crowell, Garrick Vale said, loudly enough to be heard, in a voice that was steady and unhurried. I would be honored if you would consider allowing me to court you, with the intention of marriage if we find we suit each other. The street was absolutely quiet. Tamsin could feel every eye in the vicinity. She could feel Orson somewhere behind her. She didn't turn to look. She could feel the weight of 20 years of whispers and judgments and quiet dismissals pressing against this single moment. She looked at Garrick Vale. He held her gaze. He was not performing. He was not nervous. He was simply a man standing in the street, hat in his hands, waiting. "Yes," she said. Not "I'd be honored" or "how kind of you" or any of the softer versions. Just yes, clean and direct, the way she'd always spoken when she let herself. The silence after it stretched for one more moment, and then someone at the end of the block said something to someone else, and the ordinary noise of Saturday morning started up again, and the world resumed. But something had shifted in it, something that couldn't be unshifted. Tamsin turned and walked back toward Orson's wagon without looking at anyone, and her face was perfectly still, and inside she was shaking all the way down to her boots. Not from fear. From something she hadn't felt in such a long time that it took her a full block of walking before she recognized what it was. Hope. Pure, uncomplicated, terrifying hope. The Saturday morning in Ironwill Basin had a way of stretching itself out in people's memories, the way significant moments do. Not because anything dramatic happened after Tamsin said yes, but because the shape of what those two words meant took time to settle into the community's understanding. By Sunday evening, everyone in the valley knew. By Monday morning, the theories had already begun. Tamsin heard most of them secondhand through the particular social architecture of a small community where information travels faster than horses. She heard that Garrick Vale had lost his senses in grief. She heard that Tamsin had manipulated a vulnerable widower. She heard, from a woman at the dry goods store, who said it almost kindly, that surely Tamsin understood this wouldn't really lead anywhere, that a man like Garrick had certain expectations of a wife that a woman in Tamsin's position couldn't realistically meet. She heard all of it, and she kept baking bread. The sourdough starter needed feeding regardless of what Ironwill Basin thought, and the harvest hands needed breakfast regardless of what the women at the dry goods store said, and Orson needed his coffee regardless of the fact that he had barely spoken a word to her since Saturday and communicated his displeasure through the particular weapon of cold, pointed silence that he had spent years perfecting. She was used to his silence. In some ways, she preferred it to his words. What she was not used to, what she had to consciously adjust herself to, like a person learning to walk differently after an injury, was the feeling of being waited for. Garrick Vale had told her he would call on her the following Wednesday. He had said it plainly, without ceremony, the same way he had made his offer in the street, as a statement of fact rather than a performance of intention. And so Wednesday was coming, and Tamsin found herself in the strange position of anticipating something instead of simply enduring the passage of days. She didn't trust it. That was the honest thing. She didn't trust the feeling, didn't trust the anticipation, didn't trust the small warmth that settled in her chest when she thought about the look on his face when he'd said, "I'm not playing anything." She had been wrong about a man's sincerity once, at 19, in a way that had cost her 20 years of reputation and the community's basic goodwill, and she had no intention of being wrong again. So she kept the warmth at arm's length, examined it skeptically, and went about her work. Wednesday came cold and sharp, the kind of November morning that reminds you winter is not a suggestion. Garrick arrived mid-afternoon, on time to the point that Tamsin suspected he had sat his horse a short distance from the property and waited until the exact moment before riding in, though she had no evidence of this. He came to the front of the house, which no one did. Visitors to Orson's ranch used the side entrance or the back, and the front door was theoretically for company that never came, and knocked. Orson opened it. The expression on his face lasted only a second, but Tamsin, watching from the kitchen doorway, caught it. A flicker of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but lived somewhere between the two. "Vale," Orson said. "Orson." Garrick nodded. "I've come to speak with your cousin." The words were polite and utterly immovable, and Orson had no mechanism to respond to them because no one in Ironwill Basin refused Garrick Vale a social courtesy without a reason they could defend, and Orson did not have a reason he could defend. He had only his resentment, and resentment is not a reason. He stepped back from the door. Garrick and Tamsin sat in the front room on chairs that Orson's wife had chosen before she died, rigid and slightly uncomfortable, and they talked for an hour and a half. Orson stayed visible, moving past the doorway more times than any person had legitimate business moving past a doorway. And both Tamsin and Garrick ignored this with a naturalness that suggested both of them had long practice ignoring things that were designed to make them uncomfortable. They talked about Clara, at Garrick's instigation. He said he wanted to, that he found he could talk about her more easily than he'd expected,
and he'd come to think that was because he'd had 8 months to say goodbye in small pieces, watching her go slowly, which was terrible, but also gave you time to prepare the words you needed. Tamsin listened without filling the spaces, which was something she was good at, and which Garrick seemed to notice, because he paused at one point and looked at her as though he was going to say something about it, and then decided not to. "She liked you very much," he said instead. "I liked her," Tamsin said. "She wasn't pretending at anything. By the end, I mean. Some people get smaller when they're very sick. She got more herself." Garrick was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate," he said finally. "I hadn't found the right words for it, but that's accurate." They talked about his children. I was honest about this in a way she hadn't expected. He didn't present Lenore and Silas as simply bereaved children who needed time. He described them specifically. Lenore's grief that had curdled into a kind of armor, the way she policed her mother's belongings and her mother's memory and any intrusion into either. Silas's retreat into something wordless and animal, his preference for the barn over the house, his refusal of any comfort that came in human form. He described these things the way a person describes a problem they are genuinely uncertain how to solve, not the way a person describes a problem they're asking someone else to fix. Tamsin appreciated that distinction.
"I'm not telling you this to warn you off," he said. "I'm telling you because I don't see the point in presenting things as easier than they are." "No," she said, "neither do I." They did not discuss her past that first Wednesday. That conversation was coming, they both understood it was coming, and they both seemed to be measuring the ground between them before attempting it. What they did instead was talk about the ranch, about the valley, about the particular calculus of running a cattle operation through a hard winter, about a book she had read 6 years ago that he had also read and had very different feelings about. They disagreed about the book, which seemed to please him more than agreement would have. He left before supper, which was proper, and shook her hand at the door, which was proper, and said he would call again Friday if that was all right with her. "That's all right," she said. When she closed the door and turned around, Orson was standing in the hallway. He had his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when he was about to say something he'd been rehearsing. "You know what this looks like," he said. "I expect I do. People are going to say, people have been saying things about me for 20 years, Orson. I've noticed it doesn't stop whether I do anything to cause it or not." He shifted his weight. "He's got children. I'm aware. His daughter isn't going to welcome you." "Probably not." "Then why?" "Because he asked me," Tamsin said, and her voice was quiet and even and entirely finished with this conversation. "And because I said yes, and because I'm 41 years old and I'm tired of making decisions based on what's going to be easy." She went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Orson make a short sound, not quite a word, something more like a sound a person makes when they've been wanting to argue, and the argument has been taken away from them. She didn't turn around. She fed the sourdough starter and started thinking about what to make for supper. The Friday call came, and then there was another Wednesday, and the calls continued through November with a regularity that felt to Tamsin both reassuring and faintly terrifying. She was not accustomed to being the person someone chose on purpose. She was accustomed to being useful, to being the person who appeared when things needed doing, to being thanked in the absent-minded way people thank furniture for being in the right place. Garrick Vale looked at her and appeared to be genuinely interested in the person looking back, and this was strange enough that she kept waiting for the quality of his attention to change. It didn't change. She told him about Cole Prentice on the third Wednesday. She had decided beforehand that she would do it directly, without softening, because she had found that softening a thing often makes it sound worse than the plain truth. People's imaginations filling in the softened parts with something more lurid than the reality. So she told him exactly what had happened: the marriage, the discovery, the woman with the legal document, and the 2 small children, Cole's disappearance, the subsequent years of living with a reputation that had been written without her consent. Garrick listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'd already heard pieces of it," he said. "From Clara partly, and from other places over the years." "What did you hear?" "Different versions. None of them particularly flattering to you." "What did Clara say?" He looked at her steadily. "She said you'd been treated badly by someone who should have protected you, and then badly again by everyone who should have known better, and that she'd make a point of treating you decently because she figured the universe owed you that much." Tamsin looked at her hands. She pressed her lips together once, which was as close as she was going to come to a reaction to that. She was a good woman, Tamsin said. She was, he agreed. She was also right. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't offer her reassurances, didn't tell her none of it mattered, didn't do any of the things that would have felt false coming from a man who had just admitted he'd heard the unflattering versions. He simply acknowledged what had happened and moved on, and she found that the moving on was almost more powerful than any reassurance would have been. Like he'd weighed it and found it didn't change what he thought, and there was nothing more to say. By December, she had moved out of Orson's house. This had been inevitable for some time, but Garrick had been the practical mechanism of it. He knew a woman who ran a boarding house in the east part of town and could use someone to help with cooking and cleaning in exchange for room and board. And he had mentioned this to Tamsin on a Wednesday, and she had mentioned nothing but had appeared at the boarding house the following Saturday with the only 2 bags she owned and her sourdough crock wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Pell, was small and brisk and treated Tamsin exactly as she would have treated anyone she'd hired to help, which was to say, no particular warmth, but no particular judgment either. It was the cleanest social interaction Tamsin had had in years. There was something almost restful about it. Orson said nothing when she left. He was standing in the yard when she carried her bags out, and he watched her load them onto the wagon without speaking, and she was almost to the road before he said loudly, "You'll regret this." She didn't answer. Not because she had no answer, but because she had spent 11 years answering Orson Crowell, and she had decided to stop. She drove down the road toward town with her bags in the wagon bed and her sourdough crock on the seat beside her, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly recall, that the space around her was her own. The courtship continued through December and into January, and the valley watched with the focused attention of a community that has collectively decided it has a stake in someone else's choices. The watching had a quality of waiting for Garrick to come to his senses, waiting for Tamsin to reveal some essential flaw, waiting for the whole arrangement to collapse into the kind of satisfying cautionary tale that communities sometimes need. The story refused to collapse. Garrick came twice a week, reliable as weather. He and Tamsin talked and argued occasionally, and sometimes sat together in Mrs. Pell's front room without saying much because they were both people who were comfortable in silence. He brought her books sometimes. She told him when she thought he was wrong about things, which was more often than he'd apparently expected, but which he seemed to find more interesting than irritating. She thought he was wrong about his daughter, specifically, that he was waiting for Lenora's grief to run its course before expecting anything of her, and that waiting was not always the kindest thing you could do for a person. He didn't agree, but he didn't dismiss it either. She met Lenora for the first time on a Sunday in January, and it went about as well as she'd expected, which was to say it was polite in the surface way that is actually a form of warfare. Lenora Vale was 18 years old and beautiful in the way her mother had been. Fine-featured, dark-haired, with a stillness to her that could look like poise, and was actually something more like vigilance. She looked at Tamsin the way a person looks at a structural change to a building they know well, assessing, calculating, searching for what has been compromised. "Miss Crowell," she said. "Lenora," Tamsin said. They shook hands, which was formal and strange, and then they sat in the same room for an hour while Garrick attempted to maintain a conversation that neither woman was particularly helping him maintain, and Tamsin looked at Lenora when Lenora was looking elsewhere and understood something that she filed away for later. This girl was not angry at her. She was angry at the situation. She was angry that her mother was dead, and that her father was lonely, and that life had presented her with a combination of circumstances she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to handle. Tamsin was simply the most visible symbol of all that. It would have been easier to be angry back. It would have been satisfying, in the short way that satisfying things sometimes are before they make everything worse. Instead, Tamsin looked at her carefully, and when a moment came where Lenora made a reference to one of her mother's recipes, offhand, almost involuntary, the way people sometimes speak of the dead without meaning to, Tamsin said, "She made that for me once?" "Clara did. I thought about asking her for it before she passed, and I didn't, and I've been sorry about it since." Lenora's face changed, just for a second. Then it closed again. But the second had happened, and Tamsin had seen it. Silas was a different problem entirely. She didn't meet him that Sunday. He had been visible at the edges of the house, a slight boy with a serious face who moved like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. And when Garrick had called his name, he'd appeared briefly in the doorway and then disappeared again before any proper introduction could be made. Garrick had apologized, and Tamsin had said don't, and she'd meant it. She understood, in a way she couldn't have explained, what Silas was doing. She understood the instinct to make yourself small enough that loss couldn't find you, to slip through rooms quietly, to prefer the company of animals who didn't ask anything of your grief. She had done something similar for years, for different reasons, and she recognized in him the particular posture of a person who has decided that taking up space leads to getting hurt. She didn't try to corner him. She didn't try to engineer a connection. She filed him away alongside Lenora, in the particular way she filed away things she couldn't address immediately but intended to return to. The proposal, when it came, happened at Mrs. Pell's kitchen table, which was not romantic but was exactly where Tamsin would have wanted it. Somewhere ordinary, somewhere real, not staged in some way that would have felt like theater. It was late January. Garrick had come on a Wednesday evening and they had talked for a long time, and Mrs. Pell had long since gone to bed, and the fire in the kitchen was burning down to coals. There was a quality to the evening that Tamsin had noticed and been quiet about, a kind of weight to his presence, something he was carrying toward something. "I want to marry you," he said. He said it the same way he'd made his offer in the street, plainly, without ornamentation, looking at her directly. "I want to marry you, and I'm not going to pretend it's simple. My daughter doesn't want it, and my son is too deep in his grief to want anything. The valley has feelings about it, and most of those feelings aren't kind. My ranch needs things I've been neglecting because I've been spending my energy surviving instead of planning." He paused. "And you have your own history that's going to follow you to Red Mesa, the way it's followed you everywhere else." "That's quite a proposal," Tamsin said. "It's the honest version." She looked at him for a long time. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the January wind was moving over the roofline with a low, constant sound. "What are you offering me?" she said. "A home that's actually yours. A partnership in something real. 2 children who need someone, not a replacement for their mother. I'm not asking you to be that, and I don't think you'd try, but someone patient enough to just be there." He met her eyes. "And me, which I know isn't straightforward." "No," she agreed. "Nothing about this is straightforward." "Are you saying no?" "I'm saying I'm thinking." He was quiet and let her think. That, she later decided, was the thing that settled it as much as anything he'd said. That he could sit in the silence with her without trying to fill it, without pushing, without selling. "Yes," she said, "with conditions." "Name them." "Lenora's mother's things stay as they are until Lenora is ready to make changes herself. I won't move a single item that belonged to Clara without Lenora's agreement." Garrick nodded. "Silas is not to be pressured into anything. Not acceptance, not affection, not a relationship with me that he hasn't chosen himself. I'll be there. He can come to me or not. His choice." "Agreed. And I need you to understand that I'm not good at being grateful in the way people expect." She said this carefully because it was important and she'd thought about it. "I'll do the work. I'll be loyal. I'll be honest. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life performing gratitude for being treated decently. If that's what you need, I'm the wrong woman." Garrick looked at her. His expression was something she couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something that had elements of both. "Tamsin," he said, "I spent 23 years with a woman who told me exactly what she thought. I'm not looking for gratitude, I'm looking for the truth." She absorbed this. "Then yes," she said. "My answer is yes." They were married in February, in a small ceremony at the courthouse with Mrs. Pell and one of Garrick's ranch foremen as witnesses, and afterward they drove out to Red Mesa Ranch in the cold morning light, and Tamsin carried her 2 bags into the house that had been Clara Vale's house and was now, by legal fact and social convention, hers. Lenora was standing in the hallway when they came in. She looked at Tamsin with an expression that held everything. Grief and resistance, and a complicated kind of recognition that she wasn't ready to act on. And then she said very quietly, "I put your things in the East Room. My mother's room is still—" "I know," Tamsin said. "It'll stay exactly as it is." Something moved through Lenora's face, too quick to catch. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Tamsin looked at Garrick. He was watching her. Don't, she said. Don't what? Don't look at me like I just did something remarkable. I just said a reasonable thing. Not everyone says the reasonable thing. She picked up her bags. Which room is the east room? He showed her, and she set her bags down on the bed that would now be her bed, in a house that was larger and better appointed than any she'd lived in since childhood. And she stood at the window and looked out at the frozen yard and the horses in the paddock and the great flat reach of the land that Garrick Vale had spent 20 years building. She had her sourdough crock in her bag. She needed to find the kitchen and get it settled before the temperature inside it dropped too far. She was thinking about bread. She was always thinking about bread when she was most unsettled, because bread was a problem she knew how to solve. She did not unpack the rest of her bags that first afternoon. She gave herself that much. The permission to come at it slowly, not to have to be fully arrived before she was ready. She went to the kitchen and found her way around it carefully, not moving anything, just understanding the layout of it, and when she had placed the sourdough crock on a shelf, where the temperature was right, she felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. It took her 3 days to find Silas. He was in the barn, which she had expected, but he was in a particular corner of it she hadn't thought to look, a small space behind a stack of hay bales where he had arranged a kind of nest, a blanket, a lantern, a small stack of books. He was reading when she found him, and he looked up at her with the expression of a person caught somewhere they expected to be told they shouldn't be. She looked at the space and at him. "Is there a good reason for me to tell you to come inside?" she said. He blinked. "I'm asking seriously," she said. "If you're warmer here than in the house, and you've got a lantern, and you're reading, I'm not sure it's my business." He stared at her. He was 11 years old and small for it, with his father's dark eyes and something in the set of his jaw that she'd already noticed. A stubbornness that was going to be either a serious problem or a genuine asset, depending on which way it grew. "My mother used to tell me to come inside," he said. "I know," Tamsin said. "I'm not your mother." It came out blunter than she'd intended, and she saw him flinch slightly, and she had a moment of wondering if she'd gotten this badly wrong. But then he looked at her again with something more careful in his expression, more curious, like he was recalibrating. "The horses like the company," he said finally. "I imagine they do," she said. She left him there. She went back to the kitchen and started on supper, and she didn't mention the barn to Garrick that evening. But the next morning, early, before the ranch hands were up, and before Garrick had come down from the bedroom, she was in the kitchen starting the bread when she heard a sound at the kitchen door. She turned. Silas was standing in the doorway. He was still in his outside clothes, which meant he'd come from the barn. He had his hands in his pockets. He looked at the kitchen with a kind of wariness. "What are you making?" he said. "Bread," she said. "Sourdough. It'll be a while." He didn't leave. He stood in the doorway for another moment and then came in and sat down at the far end of the kitchen table, not close, not engaged, but present. He watched her work. She didn't talk to him. She went about the bread, the flour, the water, the careful feeding of the starter into the dough, the particular kneading that required the right pressure, and she let him sit. After 20 minutes, he said, "What's that jar?" She told him about the sourdough starter. Not the whole story, not the grandmothers and the wagon and the decades, just the basic mechanics. That it was a living thing, that it needed to be fed, that if you kept it properly and didn't forget it, it would keep you in bread indefinitely. That it was alive in the same way that a plant was alive, not the same way an animal was, but not dead either. He absorbed this with the serious attention of a child who is actually interested in how things work. "Can it die?" he said. "Yes," she said. "If you don't feed it, if you freeze it, if you forget about it for too long." He was quiet for a moment. "But you never forget." "Not in 20 years, she said. He thought about this. "Can I see it?" She brought the crock over to the table and took the cloth off the top and let him look inside. He leaned over it with his face very close and looked at the starter, which was bubbling slightly in its active morning state, with the concentrated attention he might have given something much more dramatic. "It smells weird," he said. "Yeasty," she agreed. "That's how you know it's alive and working." He sat back. He looked at her, and the wariness in his face hadn't gone entirely but had shifted its quality, become something more like assessment. "Okay," he said. She wasn't sure what okay meant in this context.
She decided it didn't need to mean anything specific yet. She put the cloth back on the crock and went back to the dough. He stayed in the kitchen until the bread went into the oven.
Then he went back outside and she heard the barn door close, and she stood at the kitchen window and pressed her mouth together and watched the gray February sky and told herself firmly that this was progress and not to turn it into something larger than it was. Lenora was harder, and Tamsin had expected that. The Lenora problem was not simple resentment. If it had been simple resentment, it would have been easier to work around. What Lenora had was more complicated. She had appointed herself the guardian of her mother's memory, and she had decided, with the absolute conviction of an 18-year-old who has survived something terrible and structured her survival around a particular belief, that the way to honor her mother was to make certain that no one else could occupy the space Clara had left. This meant Tamsin found herself navigating around a territory that was mapped by absence. Every room in the house had things that couldn't be moved, arrangements that couldn't be altered, routines that had to be observed. Lenora didn't state these things as rules. She operated them through a system of silences and pointed looks, and the particular tension that enters a room when something is done wrong. Tamsin did not move anything. She did not change any arrangement without asking. She asked Lenora's opinion on things she didn't technically need an opinion on, not to flatter her, but because Lenora had been running this household for 8 months and knew things about it that Tamsin didn't, and it seemed both practical and decent to acknowledge that. Lenora had not been expecting to be asked. Tamsin could see it in the slight delay every time, the moment of recalibration before the answer came, as though Lenora had been so ready for a fight that the absence of one left her uncertain what to do. The first crack came on a Thursday evening in late February, 6 weeks after Tamsin had come to Red Mesa. She was in the kitchen working on dinner and Lenora came in, which she rarely did when Tamsin was in there. Lenora tended to treat the kitchen as neutral territory, entering only for specific purposes and leaving quickly. She stood at the counter and was quiet for a moment. "You're using sage," she said. "In the stuffing, yes." "My mother didn't use sage. She used thyme." Tamsin turned from the stove. She looked at Lenora and she made a decision. "Then tell me how she made it," she said. Lenora looked at her. "I mean it," Tamsin said. "I don't know your mother's recipes. I only know what I know. If you tell me how she made things, I can learn them." Something in Lenora's face shifted, moved through something complex and private and arrived somewhere more uncertain, less defended. "She didn't write them down," Lenora said. "Then you'll have to tell me," Tamsin said. There was a long pause, and then Lenora came to the counter and started talking, and it was a halting, careful kind of talking at first, like someone testing ice, applying weight gradually and listening for cracks. And then it became something more fluid, because food is one of the places where people carry people, where the sensory memory of someone lives long after the person is gone, and Lenora had 8 months of cooking that didn't taste right because her mother wasn't there to say why. She talked for 40 minutes. Tamsin listened and adjusted the dinner and asked questions, and by the end something had quietly changed in the kitchen that neither of them named because naming it would have made it fragile. Lenora left without saying anything that acknowledged the shift, but before she went, she stood at the door for a moment and said, "The time is in the left cabinet, 3rd shelf." Tamsin turned. "Thank you," she said. Lenora was already gone. She came back the next evening and the one after that. She didn't always talk about her mother. Sometimes she just stood in the kitchen and watched Tamsin work. In the same way Silas had that first morning, and Tamsin gave her the same courtesy she'd given the boy. She didn't push, didn't perform, didn't try to turn the presence into something it wasn't. March came in hard. The valley was locked in the deep cold of a winter that had decided to overstay itself, and the snow that had fallen in January was still on the ground and had been joined by more, and the ranch hands were working double hours, and Garrick was riding out most days before light, and Red Mesa had the particular quality of a place under pressure. Functional, but strained, every person and animal working at the edge of their capacity. Tamsin kept the house. She cooked for 11 people. She learned the particular rhythms of a working cattle ranch, when the hands needed food and in what quantities, when Garrick would be home and when he wouldn't, how the house worked and where it needed her and where it had its own momentum. She also learned something about Garrick that she hadn't quite understood from the Wednesday evenings at Mrs. Pell's house, that he was a person who carried his worries like an extra layer of clothing, so habitual he'd stopped noticing the weight. He didn't talk about the things that worried him. He absorbed them and kept moving, which was effective up to a point and destructive past it, and she had enough experience with people to see where the point was. She didn't press him, but she watched, and she filed things away, and she waited. One evening in mid-March, 2 months into their marriage, he came home late and sat at the kitchen table without eating, which he never did, and she put a plate in front of him and sat across from him and said, "What is it?" He looked at the plate. "Bank," he said. That was all he said, just the one word, and Tamsin sat with it for a moment and let him decide what to do with the rest. "There's a letter coming," he said, "from the bank in Faro County. The terms on some loans I've backed, for smaller ranches in the valley, men who couldn't have bought in without a guarantor. The bank is changing the terms." "Calling them early?" He looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "I've been listening to ranchers talk about money since I was 12 years old," she said. "It's not the first time a bank has done that to people." He was quiet. "It might not happen," he said. "I don't know yet." "But you think it will?" He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She sat with him in the kitchen while his supper went cold, not filling the silence, just being in it with him. It was a small thing. It was one of the smallest things a person can do for another person. But it was exactly the thing he needed, which she knew without him saying, and she did it without requiring him to ask. Outside, the March wind moved over the ranch, and the horses in the paddock were uneasy in the cold. And somewhere in the barn a door was banging in the way it had been banging for a week because someone had forgotten to fix the latch, and everyone was too busy to remember. Tamsin made a mental note to see to the latch herself in the morning. It was that kind of house now, and she was that kind of woman. The one who noticed the things that were coming loose, the things that needed attending, the things that would become problems if no one saw to them. It had always been her nature. The difference was that now she was seeing to them in a house that was hers to tend. And the difference between tending what belongs to you and tending what you're permitted to inhabit turned out to be larger than she had words for. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark listening to Garrick breathe beside her, and she thought about what he'd said about the bank. She thought about the ranchers she knew in the valley, the ones Garrick had backed, the ones who had small operations and thin margins and everything depending on a single good year that kept not coming. She thought about what it would mean if the bank called those loans. She didn't know yet that she was already working, somewhere below conscious thought, toward the decision that would define her. She didn't know that what was coming was bigger than a bank letter and a hard winter, and a man who'd married her out of something she hadn't yet decided whether to call love. She just lay there in the dark and thought, which was something she'd always been good at when the world was quiet enough to let her. And the sourdough starter sat in the kitchen, fed and covered and alive, the way it always was, the way it had been for 40 years before she was born, and would be, if she was careful, for 40 years after she was gone. The bank letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary enough day for something that wasn't ordinary at all. Garrick brought it in from the post without saying anything, set it on the kitchen table, and stood with his back to Tamsin for a moment in the way a person stands when they already know what a thing says and are preparing to say it out loud. She was cutting potatoes. She set down the knife and waited. He turned around. His face had the look she'd come to recognize over 3 months of marriage. The particular flatness that was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, feeling pressed down so hard it had nowhere to go. "They're calling the loans," he said. 60 days. Tamsin picked up the knife and went back to the potatoes. Not because the potatoes mattered, but because she needed a moment to think without him seeing her think. 60 days. In April, which meant by the first week of June, ranchers who had borrowed against their land would need to produce money that most of them didn't have, and couldn't get at normal terms because the same banking conditions that had prompted this letter had dried up credit across the territory. She understood the shape of it immediately. She had been listening to ranchers talk about money since she was a girl, and the architecture of a crisis like this was not complicated, even if the consequences were devastating. "How many?" she said. 6 ranches besides mine. I'm the guarantor on 4 of them." "Which ones?" He named them. She knew 3 of the 4 families personally, knew their operations, knew roughly how they'd been doing. The 4th she knew by reputation only. A young man named Aldous Marsh, who'd come into the valley 2 years ago with a small herd and big plans, and had borrowed more than was prudent because that was what young men with big plans tended to do. "And Red Mesa," she said. We can survive it if we sell well this season. If. He sat down at the table, which he rarely did in the middle of the day. The Fenner Ranch can't. The Collier boys probably can't. Marsh definitely can't. She cut the last potato, set down the knife, and sat across from him. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I don't know yet." "That's not like you." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him. His hands were flat on the table, still, and she could see in his jaw the particular tightness of a man who is running through scenarios in his head and not liking any of them. Garrick was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who could go very quiet in the face of something large, and the quiet could look like resignation from the outside even when it wasn't. "Who else knows?" she said. "About the letter? Just me. The other ranchers will have gotten their own letters. Yes, by now they're probably all getting drunk or making bad decisions. Or both," she said. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. "Or both." She was quiet for a moment, stacking the potato slices into a bowl. "Who's Silas Fitcher?" she said. The almost smile went away. Garrick looked at her with an expression that sharpened. "How do you know that name?" "I heard your foreman mention him 2 weeks ago, when they thought I was out of earshot. The way he said it, I knew it wasn't a name you were happy to hear." He was quiet for a moment, assessing something. Not whether to trust her, she thought, but how to explain it accurately. "Fitcher is a livestock buyer," he said, "based out of Harmon City. He moves through this territory every couple of years and buys up cattle at distressed prices. He watches the banks, watches the weather, watches who's leveraged past where they should be, and then he shows up when people have no other option and he offers them just enough to keep the bank from taking the land. Half what the animals are worth, sometimes less. He profits from other people's emergencies," Tamsin said. "Efficiently," Garrick said. "He's not stupid and he's not cruel exactly. He just doesn't consider other people's losses as anything that concerns him." Tamsin set the bowl of potatoes aside. She was already thinking about something, turning an idea in her mind the way she might turn a problem with dough, pressing here, seeing how it held, pressing somewhere else. "When does he usually appear?" she said. "About 6 weeks after the banks make their moves," Garrick said. "He has informants. He knows before the ranchers know sometimes." He paused. "Why?" "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" "I'll tell you when I've thought it through." He looked at her. He had learned in 3 months of marriage that when Tamsin said she would tell him when she'd thought something through, she was not putting him off. She was being literal. She did not half-form her thinking out loud. She worked it through in the private interior of her own mind, and when she was done, she said what she'd arrived at, and it was almost always worth waiting for. He nodded and didn't push. It was the right thing to do, and some part of him still marveled at the fact that the right thing to do with Tamsin was so often simply to wait and trust her, because he had not expected that from this marriage. He had expected, going in, that marrying Tamsin would be a partnership, practical, decent, useful to both of them. He had not expected the other things. He had not expected to find himself lying awake sometimes, not from worry, but from something more like wonder, at who she was, at the particular quality of her mind, at the fact that a woman that capable and that clear-eyed had spent 11 years in his neighbor's kitchen without anyone appearing to notice. He pushed back from the table. "I need to ride out to Fenner," he said. "Tell him before he hears it somewhere else." "Take him something," Tamsin said. "What?" "Food. Take him something. His wife just had a baby in February. Don't arrive with bad news and nothing else." Garrick paused. Then he nodded. She wrapped up half a loaf of bread in a jar of last summer's peach preserves, and he took them without comment, and she watched him ride out from the kitchen window. The idea she'd been turning in her mind continued to turn. The thing about Tamsin was that she saw systems where other people saw individual problems. She had always done this, from the time she was young. The way a kitchen ran efficiently was a system. The way a sick household could be managed was a system. The way a community could be organized to survive a hard winter was a system. Individual pieces were less interesting to her than the way pieces connected to each other, the way a change in one place produced changes in unexpected others. What she was seeing now was a particular kind of problem that looked from the outside like several separate problems. The bank loans, the threatened ranches, the imminent arrival of Silas Fitcher, the hard winter that had delayed the season. But from the inside, from the place in her mind where she did her real thinking, It was one problem, and one problem, properly understood, could have one solution. The question was whether the solution was possible, and whether anyone would trust her enough to try it. She spent 3 days in the thinking. She cooked and cleaned and managed the house, and fed the sourdough starter and handled all the ordinary business of Red Mesa. And she turned the idea over, examining it from different angles, looking for the places where it could break. There were several. She worked through each one, looking for what would need to be true for the break not to happen. And by the end of 3 days, she understood what she needed to understand. She needed Garrick, not just his agreement. She needed him to trust her completely and without reservation, in a way that would look, to the people he'd be asking to trust her too, as though Garrick Vale had put his weight behind his wife's judgment. In Ironwill Basin, in 1893, that meant something specific. It meant that a woman's idea could be taken seriously if the right man stood behind it, which was an ugly reality, but still a reality, and Tamsin had long since stopped letting ugly realities keep her from using everything available to her. She told him on a Thursday evening after supper, when Lenora had gone to help Silas with something in the barn and the kitchen was quiet. She laid it out plainly, the way she always presented things: the pieces, the connections, the risks, the possible outcome if it worked. Garrick listened without interrupting. He had his elbows on the table and his hands folded under his chin, which was how he listened to things he was taking seriously. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "One herd," he said. "One herd," she confirmed. "Your cattle, the Fenners, the Collier boys, Marshes, and whoever else is willing. Drive them together to the railhead at Copper Creek, 70 miles. In April, across the rim." "Yes." "Tamsin, the rim road in April is—" "I know what it is," she said. "I also know that Fitcher's last shipment came through Copper Creek, and that there was a delay at the junction in Harmon City. I heard your foreman talking about it. If Fitcher is expecting to fill those railroad cars, and he can't get his own cattle there in time, he needs product. He needs it badly enough to negotiate." Garrick stared at her. "How do you know about his railroad cars?" "I listen," she said. "People say things in front of me because they've been deciding I'm not worth accounting for my whole life. It's been inconvenient in some ways. In other ways, it's been useful." He was quiet, working through it. She could see him doing it. The mental map of the territory, the logistics, the timing, the question of whether the other ranchers would agree to pool their cattle with his, which required a level of trust between competing operations that didn't come easily. "They won't like taking direction from me," she said, before he could raise it. That's exactly what you were about to say. It's all right, it's accurate." She looked at him steadily. "That's why you'll be there. Not as the man in charge, as the man who trusts me. There's a difference. If you stand beside me and make it clear that you believe in this, some of them will follow your judgment even if they don't have enough information to trust mine." "And the ones who don't?" "Then they lose their ranches to Fitcher," she said. "That'll be their choice." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Ride with me to the Fenner place tomorrow, and to the Collier boys. Let me explain it to them myself. You be there so they know you're behind it. Let me talk." He nodded. "All right." She hadn't been certain he'd say yes. She had believed he might. She had spent 3 months learning him, and she understood his particular kind of respect, the kind that wasn't about authority, but about demonstrated competence. But belief and certainty were different things, and when he said all right, something unclenched in her that she hadn't known was clenched. They rode out the next morning. The Fenner place was 7 miles east, and by the time they arrived, Tamsin already knew the meeting wasn't going to go easily, because Pete Fenner was standing in his yard with the look of a man who had spent 3 days being angry and was ready to direct that anger at anyone who came through his gate. He was in his mid-40s, square-built, with hands that were never quite clean no matter how much he washed them. He'd had the ranch for 16 years and had built it himself from a section of land that nobody else had wanted. And the idea that a bank could take it from him in 60 days had produced in him the particular fury of a person who has worked so hard for something that losing it feels like a violation of some basic law. He looked at Garrick, and then he looked at Tamsin, and the second look was a little longer and a little more uncertain. "Garrick," he said. "Who's this?" "My wife," Garrick said. "She has an idea I want you to hear." Fenner's eyes went back to Tamsin. She recognized the assessment in them. It wasn't hostile. It was the evaluating look of a practical man wondering whether his time was about to be wasted. "I heard you married," he said to Garrick, "the Crowell woman." Tamsin, she said before Garrick could answer. My name is Tamsin. Fenner looked at her for a beat. All right, he said. Come inside. They sat at the Fenner table, and Tamsin talked. She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for Garrick, plainly, without softening the risk, without promising things she couldn't promise. She told him about Fitcher and the railroad cars. She told him what a combined herd could do that a single operation's cattle couldn't. She told him about the timing and the route across the rim. Fenner's wife, a small, quiet woman named Ruth, who was nursing a 2-month-old baby while they talked, asked a question that Fenner hadn't thought to ask. Who drives the herd? The men we have between us, Tamsin said. Garrick's hands, yours, the colliers. I'll ride with them. Ruth looked at her with an expression that Tamsin couldn't entirely read. Then she looked at Fenner. Let her finish, Ruth said. Fenner argued for 20 minutes. I was suspicious of the logic around Fitcher's railroad cars. How could she know? How could anyone know for certain? And he was suspicious of pooling his animals with Garrick's because what happened if there was a discrepancy in the count at the other end? And he was suspicious of a 70-mile drive across the rim in April because he'd done that road in May once, and it had been ugly. Tamsin answered each objection without losing her patience. She had been answering objections from men who didn't want to trust her since she was old enough to have ideas. And she had learned that the objections were not usually the real problem. The real problem was the trust, and the objections were what people put up while they were deciding about the trust. At the end of 20 minutes, Fenner sat back in his chair and looked at Garrick. You believe this? I believe her, Garrick said. There's a distinction. Fenner turned that over. Then he looked at Tamsin. If we lose cattle on that drive, who covers it? We split the loss proportionally across all the operations, Tamsin said. Same as the gain. And if Fitcher doesn't play the way you think he will? Then we sell to whoever will buy. We'll still be better off selling together than separately. Fenner was quiet. Pete, Ruth said from the corner where she was settling the baby. Do it. Fenner looked at his wife. He looked at Tamsin. He looked at Garrick. Then he exhaled heavily, which was not agreement, but was the sound a man makes immediately before agreement. Fine, he said. God help us all. The Collier brothers were easier. There were 2 of them, Marcus and Eli, and they had a habit of agreement between themselves that translated into agreeing with others faster than most people did. They said yes before she'd finished, which concerned her slightly more than it reassured her, because people who agreed before they'd thought things through tended to develop reservations later at inconvenient moments. Aldous Marsh was the hard one. She had known it would be Marsh. I was 26 years old and had the combination of pride and fear that sits in young men who've borrowed heavily against a future they were certain about and are beginning to doubt. He didn't want to admit how bad his situation was. He didn't want to depend on anyone else's operation to save his. And he had heard, from somewhere, the version of Tamsin's history that the valley had been circulating, and the expression on his face when she walked through his door said that he had decided certain things about who she was before she'd opened her mouth. She sat at his table and talked anyway. He interrupted her 3 times in the first 10 minutes, each time with an objection that was really a version of the same objection. He didn't trust this, he didn't trust her, and he was having difficulty saying so directly. Garrick started to speak once, and Tamsin put her hand on his arm, barely, just a touch, and he stopped. Mr. Marsh, she said, I can see you have concerns about me specifically. I'd rather you say them than not. Marsh looked at her. His jaw shifted. People talk about you, he said, about where you came from. People talk about everyone, she said. What are they saying? He looked genuinely caught off guard by the directness of that. He shifted in his chair. They say you were married before, he said, that it was irregular. I was deceived, she said, without heat, by a man who was already married. I was 19. I didn't know. The community chose to blame me rather than him, which I can't control, and couldn't then. What I can control is sitting in front of you with a plan that will likely save your ranch, if you'll stop looking for a reason not to hear it. Marsh was quiet. Or, she said, you can wait for Fitcher. He'll be here in about 3 weeks. He'll give you $19 a head, and it'll be enough to pay the bank and nothing else. And you'll spend the next 2 years trying to rebuild from almost nothing. She looked at him steadily. What people say about me and whether you agree with it doesn't change the math. Marsh stared at the table for a long moment. $24 a head, he said. You really think you can get that? At minimum, she said. If I'm right about Fitcher's cars. And if you're wrong, then you still get more than 19. He looked at Garrick, who said nothing. Then he looked back at Tamsin. All right, he said. It came out like it cost him something. All right. The plan was in motion. The next 10 days had a quality Tamsin had felt only a few times in her life. A kind of directed momentum, the feeling of pieces moving toward a shape she could see but hadn't yet made real. She organized the logistics with Garrick's foreman, a laconic man named Hatch, who had initial reservations about the whole thing and expressed them in the two-word communication style that was his natural mode. She coordinated with the Fenner and Collier hands about timing and route. She ordered supplies. And then the thing she hadn't planned for arrived, on a morning in the third week of April. It arrived in the form of a boy. I was 17 years old, and he had come to the kitchen for his morning meal with the harvest crew, and Tamsin saw his face when he came through the door, and she saw his throat, and her stomach dropped straight through the floor. The grayish patches were at the back, visible only because the boy had his collar loose and had tilted his head back to swallow against what was clearly pain. She had seen this before. She had hoped she would never see it again. She had seen it 17 years ago, in the winter of 1876, during 3 weeks that had taken 11 people she knew and taught her more about isolation and survival than she had ever wanted to know. Diphtheria. She crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and said to the boy quietly, not in front of the others, "Come with me outside." He looked confused, but he came. She took him to the corner of the yard away from the bunkhouse and the other men, and she looked at his throat in the morning light, and she asked him 3 questions. When did the soreness start? Had he been in contact with anyone from outside the valley recently, and how did he feel right now? His answers confirmed what she already knew. She turned to Hatch, who had come out of the bunkhouse behind them. "I need you to get Garrick," she said. "Now. Don't explain to the other men. Just get him. And don't let that boy back inside with the others." Hatch looked at her. He looked at the boy. Something in his face shifted. "Is it what I think it is?" he said. "Get Garrick," she said again. By the time Garrick came, she had the boy sitting on a fence rail away from the buildings, and she had sent a ranch hand she trusted to tell the other harvest workers to wait in the bunkhouse until further notice. The hand had looked at her with questions on his face, and she had said please in a tone that ended questions, and he had gone. Garrick came out of the house at a pace that wasn't quite running and looked at her face and said, "What?" "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to do exactly what I say," she told him. "And I need you not to argue about it until I'm done explaining." He said, "All right," she told him. The ranch went into quarantine that morning. This was not a simple thing. It was not a thing that everyone accepted calmly. 2 of the harvest hands tried to leave, not out of cowardice exactly, but out of the very human instinct to put distance between yourself and a word like diphtheria. And it was Garrick who stood between them and the gate and said they would stay. And his voice when he said it was the kind of voice that didn't offer options. "You heard my wife," he said. "We stay until she says otherwise." The local doctor arrived late that afternoon. His name was Breer, and he was not a bad doctor, but he was a man who trusted what he could see over what he was told, and what Tamsin was telling him required him to trust her judgment over his own examination, which was not something he found natural. He looked at the boy's throat. He looked at Tamsin. It isn't something else," she said. "I've seen it. I was 24 years old when the outbreak went through Caddo Flats, and I spent 3 weeks in houses where people were dying from it. I know what I'm looking at." "You're not a doctor," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm a woman who watched 11 people die and learned everything about the illness because that was the only thing I could do that might help." She looked at him without apology. "I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, you keep a ranch quarantined for 2 weeks, and everyone is annoyed with me. If I'm right and you override me, this goes through the valley, and we lose people." Breer looked at her for a long moment, his mouth pressed together. 2 weeks, he said. "At minimum," she said. He left without agreeing, which was not the same as disagreeing, and Tamsin turned back to the problem of managing a quarantined ranch. She had done this before. She had not done it on this scale. Red Mesa had 11 people in the main house and bunkhouse, and if the sickness moved, it would move fast. But the principles were ones she knew. Separate the sick from the well, clean obsessively, manage the air in the rooms, Keep people fed and warm and as calm as possible, because fear compromised the body in ways that made illness worse. She organized it without asking anyone's permission. She assigned spaces. The sick boy went to the tack room, which was isolated and ventilatable, where Garrick's hands set up a cot. She established rules about which hands went into which spaces and which ones didn't. She set up a system for food delivery that kept the infected space separate from the main kitchen. Silas watched her do all of this from various distances throughout the day. He was 12 now, quiet and observant, and he had developed over the past 2 months the habit of tracking Tamsin's movements with his eyes without appearing to. She had noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly and without comment. At one point in the late afternoon, he appeared at her elbow while she was boiling water. "What can I do?" he said. She looked at him. I was serious, which was his default expression, but there was something extra in it, a wanting to be useful that she recognized because she had felt it herself at his age. The desperate desire to do something with your hands when the thing happening around you was too large for helplessness. "Can you keep a list accurately?" she said. "Yes. I need someone to keep track of who's been in contact with the sick room. Every person, every time, what they did. Can you do that without it getting confused?" "Yes," he said again. She handed him a small notebook and a pencil that she pulled from her apron pocket. "Every name, every time. Come find me if you're not sure whether something needs to be written down." He took the notebook like it was something important, because, she supposed, it was. That evening, the sick boy's fever spiked. Tamsin sat with him through the worst of it, which was the kind of nursing that doesn't look like much from the outside. Wiping fever sweat, offering water in small sips, keeping him from panicking when his breathing became labored. She had learned during the Caddo Flats outbreak that the panic was as dangerous as the illness sometimes, that a person who was frightened could exhaust themselves fighting what they couldn't fight. She talked to the boy when he was coherent. When he wasn't, she was simply present. His name was Thomas Weil, and he was from a farm in the next county, and he was saving money to buy land of his own someday. He told her this in a lucid moment around midnight, in the particular way sick people share the important things, quickly, as though uncertain how long the clarity will last. "You'll buy it," she said. "You don't know that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you're young and otherwise healthy, and you got here early in the illness, which matters. The chances are in your favor." He was quiet. "Are you scared?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I've been scared about this disease before," she said. "I respect it. But I'm not scared right now. I know what to do." It wasn't entirely true. There were things about diphtheria that no one knew how to manage, places where medicine in 1893 simply didn't reach. But it was true enough to be useful, and he seemed to settle somewhat after she said it. She stayed until 4 in the morning, when his fever broke enough that she could leave him safely with one of the younger ranch hands she deemed low risk. She walked back to the main house in the dark. The ranch was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a place holding its breath. She was tired in her bones, the deep tired that doesn't respond to sitting down, and she stood on the porch for a moment looking at the black sky and the hard cold stars, and letting the night air move around her. The door opened behind her. Garrick came out and stood beside her without speaking. He put his hand on her shoulder, not a performance of support, but the simple action of a person wanting to be in contact with another person, and she let herself lean into it slightly, which was not something she did easily. "How is he?" Garrick said. "Better tonight. We'll see." "The doctor came back," he said. "Breer." He looked at the boy again, and he paused. "He said you were right." Tamsin said nothing. "He didn't say it gracefully," Garrick added. "They never do," she said. They stood on the porch in the cold for another minute. Then Tamsin straightened. "I need to map the exposures," she said. "Thomas came from the east side of the valley. If he had contact with anyone before he came here—" "In the morning," Garrick said. "It needs to—" "In the morning," he said again, and his voice was not insistent, just steady. "You've been up for 20 hours. An hour's sleep won't lose us anything." She looked at him. "Tamsin," he said. "An hour." She thought about the list in Silas's notebook. She thought about the map she needed to draw, the households she needed to reach, the system she needed to build to manage what was probably already spreading through the valley. She thought about all of it pressing toward her from every direction. 2 hours, she said. 2 hours, he agreed. She went inside, and she lay down on the bed without undressing. and she was asleep in 6 minutes. She dreamed about the Caddo Flats outbreak, which she hadn't dreamed about in years. The houses she'd entered, the families she'd separated, the particular expression on people's faces when she told them they couldn't see their sick relatives. She had made enemies that winter. She had made them by doing the right thing, and they had never forgiven her for it. She woke up before the 2 hours were done. The mapping began in earnest the next morning. Thomas Weil, when she questioned him carefully in the clear-headed way people sometimes have in the aftermath of a bad night, told her he had come directly from his family farm and had stopped for water at a homestead 3 miles east of Red Mesa. He remembered talking to the family there for maybe 20 minutes. He had been feeling poorly then, but had put it down to tiredness. 20 minutes of contact. 3 miles east. Tamsin saddled a horse herself and rode out there before breakfast. The Kettrick family, a husband, wife, and 3 children, were fine when she arrived. No symptoms. She told them what had happened, plainly and without softening, and she told them what they needed to watch for and what to do if any symptoms appeared, and she asked them not to have visitors for 2 weeks. Mrs. Kettrick, who was practical and calm in the way that some farming women are, because they've handled enough genuine emergencies that a new one doesn't undo them, listened to all of this and said, "What do we do about supplies?" "I'll send them," Tamsin said. She had not planned that. She said it, and then she understood, in the moment of saying it, that it was the only answer, that the reason quarantines failed, the reason people broke them, the reason sick households contaminated healthy ones during the Caddo Flats outbreak 17 years ago, was not because people were foolish or careless, but because they had no way to survive inside them. They had to leave for food, for water, for feed for the animals. Isolation was a luxury that only made sense if someone removed the necessity of ending it. She rode back to Red Mesa with the cold morning wind in her face and another piece of a system assembling in her mind. She mapped every household Thomas might have reached, 7 by direct contact, another 4 by proximity, neighbors of the first 7, people who shared water sources or grazing land. She drew it out on a piece of paper at the kitchen table, with Silas sitting across from her using his notebook, and when she had the map, she looked at it and understood the scale of what she was dealing with. 11 households, Silas said. He was looking at the paper seriously, counting. 11 so far, she said. If anyone in those households had visitors since last Thursday, it gets bigger, he said. Yes. He chewed his lip. He did this when he was thinking hard, she had noticed. How do you keep track of all of them? That's what the map is for, she said. And that's why your list is important. Every exposure, every connection, every person who might carry it from one place to another. She looked at him. Does that make sense? It's like a web, he said, and you're following the threads. She looked at him. He was 12 years old, and he had just described epidemic contact tracing more accurately than most adults she'd tried to explain it to. Yes, she said, exactly like that. Something that might have been satisfaction moved across his face. Not pride exactly, more the particular pleasure of having understood something accurately. By the end of that week, the Dr. Breer had come back to Red Mesa 3 times. The 3rd time he came with his hat in his hand and an expression that cost him something. I've had 2 more cases, he said, both east of here, both with connections to your first boy. He paused. How did you know to act so quickly? I did this before, she said, in Caddo Flats 17 years ago. He looked at her. I heard about Caddo Flats, he said. They called it contained. I didn't know who contained it. Several people did, she said. I was one of them. He was quiet. I owe you an apology, he said, for the other day. I don't need it, she said. I need your help. Tell me the 2 new households and let's figure out who else they've touched. He looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled a piece of paper from his coat and laid it on the table. They worked side by side for 3 hours. He knew things she didn't. Medical specifics, family situations in the valley, which households had already been sick with other things, and might be more vulnerable. She knew things he didn't, the logic of tracing, the system of supply delivery, the way to talk to a family in a quarantined house without making them feel like they'd been locked away to die. By the end of those 3 hours, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but the particular respect that grows between 2 people who are working hard toward the same thing and are discovering that the other person is competent. You'll need more supplies than one ranch can provide, Breer said. I know, she said. I'll figure it out. How? The same way I figure everything out, she said. By doing it. He almost smiled. All right, he said. What do you need? Garrick had been listening from the doorway for the last part of this. When Breer left, he came in and stood at the table looking at the map she and Silas had made. Tell me what you need, he said. She looked at the map. She thought about the cattle drive, which was now 3 weeks out and already organized, already depending on the hands and the timing she'd arranged, and the disease moving through the valley, and the bank's 60-day clock that had 20 days left on it. All of it at once, everything pressing from every direction. Riders, she said. I need riders who can make deliveries to quarantined households without going inside. And I need the kitchen scaled up. I'm going to need to bake every day. How much bread? She looked at the map again. 11 households, averages of 4 to 6 people each, quarantine of 2 weeks minimum. Start with 60 loaves, she said. We'll see. Garrick nodded and went to find Hatch. Silas was still at the table with his notebook. He looked at the map and then at her. Are you going to sleep tonight? He said. It was such an adult question, and said with such a particular combination of concern and practicality, that she looked at him for a moment before answering. Some, she said. That means no, he said. She gathered the map and the list. Go help your father, she said. And Silas? She waited until he looked at her. That work you did this week. The list. You did it well. He looked at her. Then he looked away, which was how he accepted things he didn't know how to answer. She went to the kitchen and started the bread. Outside, the April wind was cold and steady, and somewhere in the valley, another household was waking up to a morning that would soon be different from the one they'd expected, and Tamsin Garrick Vale was already thinking about what they would need and how to get it to them. She had spent her life being overlooked. She had spent years being the person who appeared when things needed doing and disappeared from the credit afterward. She had fed and tended and organized and managed, and most of it had gone unnoticed in the way that essential things go unnoticed. You don't think about air until you don't have enough of it. She was thinking about bread. She was always thinking about bread when the world was coming apart at the edges. But underneath the thinking about bread, deeper and steadier than any single practical thought, something was clarifying. The disease in the valley was real. The bank deadline was real. The cattle drive was still coming, and everything she'd organized still needed to happen. And the same woman who had spent 11 years invisible in a kitchen was now the person the valley needed most, whether the valley knew it yet or not. The kitchen at Red Mesa had never been built for what it became in the last week of April. Tamsin had converted it by necessity and without ceremony, moved the ordinary meal preparation to one end, commandeered the larger work table for bread production, and established a rhythm that started before 4 in the morning and didn't stop until after dark. The sourdough starter, which had been feeding 4 people's worth of bread since February, was now being divided and expanded every night, its living culture split into 4 crocks that lined the back shelf like sentinels. 60 loaves had become 70. By the end of the second week of quarantine operations, she was producing 80 loaves a day, and there were mornings when she stood at the work table with flour to her elbows and a tiredness in her body that was not quite pain, but lived in the same neighborhood, and she thought about nothing except the next batch and the next household on the delivery route. Lenora had started helping without being asked. This was the thing that Tamsin had not anticipated, or had not let herself anticipate, because anticipating things you want has always been a reliable way to ensure they don't happen. But on the third morning of full production, she had come into the kitchen at 4 and found Lenora already there, in her work dress, feeding the starters with the careful attention of someone who had been watching the process long enough to understand it. Tamsin had stopped in the doorway. Lenora didn't look up. You showed Silas how to do this, she said. He showed me. Did he? He's 12, Lenora said. He wrote it down in that notebook of his. She paused. You should have a second person who knows how, in case you can't do it. It was the most practical thing anyone had said to Tamsin in weeks, and it came from the girl who had been watching her with a vigilant measuring distance for 2 months. Tamsin came into the kitchen and tied on her apron and started work without making anything of it, and Lenora worked beside her in a silence that was different from all the previous silences between them. This one had a purpose to it. This one was going somewhere. They worked together every morning after that. The delivery system had been organized by Garrick and Hatch with the efficiency that comes from men who are good at logistics and have been given a clear picture of what's needed. 3 riders went out every morning before 7 with wagon loads: bread, dried meat, milk and sealed crocks, feed for the animals of quarantined households. Tamsin had written instructions for each household, specific to their situation, about what to watch for and what to do if symptoms changed. She had given the same instructions verbally to each rider because written instructions only worked if the people receiving them could read, and not everyone in the valley could. The Dr. Breer came to Red Mesa every 2 days now. The formality between them had been replaced by something more functional. Not warmth, exactly, but the working relationship of 2 people who have decided they are on the same side of a problem. He brought her information. She gave him the map updates and the contact list that Silas kept with a meticulous precision that continued to surprise her, though it was beginning to surprise her less. The boy had a mind for systems, for tracking, for the connections between things. He didn't talk much about what he was doing, but he did it without errors and without losing track of any piece, and that was worth more to Tamsin than conversation. 14 days into the quarantine, Thomas Wile's fever came down for good. Tamsin went to the tack room that morning and found him sitting up on the cot for the first time, weak and thin-faced and with the particular look of a person who has been somewhere far away and has come back unsure of what they'll find. She brought him a bowl of broth and a piece of bread and sat in the chair beside him while he ate. "How many?" he said. He meant how many sick in the valley. 17 households, she said. So far. His face tightened. Because of me. Because of the disease, she said. You didn't bring it here on purpose. But I'm where it started. She looked at him steadily. You're also where the quarantine started, because you came to this kitchen first. If you'd been somewhere else, somewhere without a system to catch it, it would have moved further before anyone knew what it was. He stared at the broth. Eat, she said. He ate. She sat there with him until the bowl was empty, and then she went back to the kitchen because there were 70 loaves waiting to be shaped and the morning was moving and there was no time to sit longer. By this point, Garrick was sick. He had not told her when it started. He was not a man who said, I'm not well. He was a man who continued at the same pace and hoped his body would sort itself out, which was an approach that Tamsin had come to understand was deeply ingrained in him and probably couldn't be argued out of. She had noticed things, though. The way he came in from riding 2 hours earlier than usual, 3 days in a row. The way he sat at the supper table and ate less than his appetite usually demanded. The way he answered her questions with slightly more effort than they required. She had put her hand on his forehead on the 4th evening, in the kitchen when no one else was around, and his skin was warm. He looked at her. It's not the same thing, he said. It's not diphtheria. No, she agreed. Your throat looks normal, but you're running a fever. Overworked. Overworked and feverish, she said, which is a different thing. She made him go to bed that night, and he went, which told her more than the fever did. Garrick Vale going to bed before 10 o'clock on a working evening was the clearest possible signal that his body had made a decision his mind hadn't caught up to yet. By morning, it was clear he had a chest sickness. Not the diphtheria, not the epidemic, but the separate mundane cruelty of a fever and a deep cough that came from somewhere in his lungs that shouldn't have been producing sound. She had seen it before, the kind of illness that settles into men who have been pushing too hard in cold weather for too many weeks, whose bodies are running on determination rather than reserves. She told him to stay in bed, and he said he couldn't. The drive is in 10 days, he said. He was sitting up in bed with the effort of a man who doesn't want to look as bad as he feels. Hatch can't organize it without me. Hatch can organize it fine, she said. I'll work with Hatch. Tamsin, you're not getting on a horse, she said. Not for 3 days at minimum. That's not a negotiation. He looked at her with an expression she had come to know, the one that meant he was deciding whether to fight something, calculating whether the fight was worth the cost. 3 days, he said. 3 days, and then we'll see. She went downstairs and found Hatch in the yard. Hatch was a man of 50, with a permanent squint from years of riding into wind and a communication style that conveyed considerable information in very few words. He had worked for Garrick for 9 years, and he had accepted Tamsin's presence at Red Mesa with the particular neutrality of a man who has no opinion about arrangements above his pay grade, which she had respected. He looked at her now with the squint. He's bad? Chest, she said. He needs to rest. I need you to help me run the next 10 days. You know cattle drives, he said. I know logistics, she said. You know the cattle and the route. Between us, we cover it. Hatch thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. All right, he said. She spent that morning with Hatch and came away understanding, in specific terms, what the next 10 days required. The Fenner hands were arriving in 5 days with their cattle. The Collier brothers' herd was coming 2 days after that. Marsh's animals were the variable. Marsh had been sending word through a hired rider because he was the furthest out, and the last message suggested his timetable was behind by almost a day. Can we absorb a day's delay? She asked Hatch. Maybe, he said. Depends on weather. She went back inside and wrote a letter to Marsh, clear and specific about timing, and sent a rider with it. Then she went to the kitchen and baked bread and thought about weather, which was not something she could control, and then thought about what she could control instead, which was a more productive use of her mind. Garrick's cough woke her 3 nights in a row. She would lie in the dark listening to it, the deep, rattling kind that comes from the chest, not the throat. And she would count the intervals between coughs the way she had learned to count things in sick houses, looking for whether the pattern was improving or worsening. She got up the second night and made him a steam treatment from the herbs she kept in the kitchen. And she sat in the room while he breathed it, and he looked at her in the lamplight with an expression that she filed away in the place where she kept the things she didn't talk about. You should be sleeping, he said. I should be doing a lot of things, she said. Hold the bowl closer. He held the bowl closer. Tamsin, he said, in the pause between coughs. If the drive doesn't work, it'll work. But if it doesn't, Garrick. She met his eyes. Let me worry about the drive. You worry about breathing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you know, when I asked you to marry me, I didn't fully understand what I was asking. She looked at him. What does that mean? I thought I was asking a capable woman to come and help manage a household, he said. His voice was rough with the cough, and beneath the roughness, there was something that was working its way out, the way things work themselves out in people when they've been sick enough to lower their guard. I didn't know I was asking. He stopped. I didn't know who you were yet. She sat with that for a moment. I'm the same person I was, she said. I know that, he said. That's the part I didn't understand going in, that you were already this person and nobody had been paying attention. The steam rose between them. Hold the bowl, she said again, because she didn't have words for the other part, or the words she had were ones she wasn't ready to say in a sick room with a man who might be more feverish than he was admitting. But she held on to what he'd said. She carried it with her the way she carried things she needed, carefully, in a place where it wouldn't get damaged. On the 5th day, Pete Fenner arrived with his cattle. He came into the Red Mesa yard with 240 animals and 4 hands and an expression that said he was doing this because he'd said he would, but he hadn't entirely stopped having reservations. He looked around for Garrick and found Tamsin instead. Where's Vale? He said. Sick, she said. Chest. He'll be functional by the drive, but for now you're dealing with me and Hatch. Fenner looked at her. He had the same evaluating expression he'd had at his kitchen table 6 weeks ago, but there was something different in it now. Not quite trust, but a reduced distance. All right, he said. She showed him where to put the cattle. She showed him where his hands would sleep and where they'd eat. And she made sure Ruth Fenner's 2-month-old baby and the other children were mentioned directly. That she'd sent them a supply delivery last week, and that the family had been checked for symptoms and were fine. Fenner looked at her when she said this. I heard you were running deliveries to the quarantine houses, he said. We are. Who pays for that? Right now, Red Mesa, she said. When this is over, we'll figure out what the valley owes and see who can contribute what. Fenner looked at her for another moment. My wife talks about you, he said. I know. What she says is... He stopped. He was not a man who came naturally to this kind of conversation. She says you're the kind of person she'd want around in a bad time. Coming from Ruth Fenner, by way of Pete Fenner, through the particular awkwardness of a man trying to offer a compliment, it landed like something genuine. Tell her thank you, Tamsin said. The Collier brothers arrived 2 days later, loud and cheerful in the way they always were, which Tamsin found both exhausting and oddly steadying. Marcus and Eli Collier were the kind of men who treated every difficulty as a temporary inconvenience, which was sometimes infuriating and sometimes exactly what a situation needed. Marsh arrived the following morning, one day behind his stated schedule, with his 160 animals and the particular expression of a man who is not sure he made the right decision but has gone too far to change it. He didn't say much. He found his spot in the yard and put his cattle with the others and watched the growing herd with something that might have been wonder. 930 animals assembled in one place, the combined weight of 5 operations, an enormous and improbable fact. The morning of the drive, Garrick came downstairs. He was pale and had lost weight from the illness, and the cough was still there, reduced but not gone. And Tamsin looked at him from across the kitchen and said nothing because she knew the expression on his face and she knew what it meant. "I'm not asking," he said. "I know. I'll take the wagon if I have to, but I'm— Garrick!" She brought him his coffee. "I said I know." He took the coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You've been running everything," he said. "Hatch has been running everything," she said. "I've been helping." He didn't argue with that because they both knew it wasn't accurate, and they both knew this wasn't the moment for accuracy on that particular point. There were 930 cattle in the yard and 22 men preparing to move them and a 70-mile drive across the frozen rim, and the time for discussing who had been running what was later. She had packed the sourdough crock the night before. She almost hadn't. There was a reasonable argument that leaving it with Lenora, who knew the feeding routine now, who was competent and careful and would not forget, was the sensible choice. The crock was fragile. The drive would be cold and rough, and there were 100 things that could go wrong with the clay jar on the back of a horse or in a wagon bed. But she thought about her grandmother. She thought about the wagon west 40 years ago, and the crock wrapped in cloth and tucked between the possessions that the family had deemed worth saving. She thought about how the starter had come through things that weren't designed to be survived, and how it had come through because someone always remembered to carry it. She packed it in her saddlebag, wrapped in the same cloth her grandmother had used, which was worn to translucence now, but still intact. Lenora came out to see them off in the gray morning before the sun was fully up. She stood in the yard with her arms crossed against the cold and watched the organized chaos of nearly 1,000 cattle and more than 20 riders preparing to move. And her face had the complicated expression it wore when she was feeling something she hadn't decided how to classify. When Tamsin came out with her saddlebags, Lenora looked at the particular shape of the bundle on one side and said, "You're taking the crock." "Yes." "Why?" Tamsin thought about how to answer that honestly without making it into more than it needed to be. "Because it's come through worse," she said. Lenora was quiet. Then, "Come back safe." It was the first time she had said anything like that. The first time she had said anything to Tamsin at the door of a departure that was not about the house, or the bread, or the practical business of who would do what in Tamsin's absence. Tamsin looked at her. "We will," she said. She mounted her horse and rode to the front of the herd, where Hatch was waiting with an expression that conveyed nothing beyond readiness, and the drive began. The first day was controlled chaos, which was the best you could hope for with a mixed herd from 5 different operations. Animals that had spent their lives in separate pastures had no interest in one another, and even less in the concept of cooperative movement. The first 6 hours were the sound of cattle complaining and men working and dust rising in the cold morning air, and Tamsin rode the edges of it all with Hatch's directions in her head, and her own eyes moving constantly over the mass of movement. She was not an experienced cattle hand. She knew this and didn't pretend otherwise. What she was organized, observant, and capable of staying calm when things went wrong, which they did, multiple times, in the first day alone. A section of the Fenner cattle broke away from the main herd in the early afternoon, and it took 3 riders and 40 minutes to bring them back. One of Marsh's animals went down with a leg injury and had to be dealt with, which cost another hour and affected Marsh's mood for the rest of the afternoon. A rider from the Collier contingent got his horse spooked at a creek crossing and came off, and the horse ran 300 yards before it was caught, and the rider was uninjured but badly rattled. Garrick rode in the wagon for the first day, which cost him visibly, not in any complaint he made, but in the set of his jaw, the way he watched the riders from the wagon bed with the look of a man watching something he should be in the middle of from the wrong side of a window. By the end of the first day, they had made 16 miles. Not ideal, but survivable as a pace. The second day was colder. The The rim road, which began in earnest on the second afternoon, was not actually a road. It was a route, a track through territory that had been used enough times that you could read the signs of previous passage if you knew what you were looking for, but which offered none of the accommodations of a real road. It went up and it went across and it went down, and in April the up portions were still frozen hard, and the across portions were either frozen or thawing in unpredictable patches, and the down portions were the kind of steep that makes 900 cattle into a physics problem. Tamsin rode the approach to the first serious ascent with Hatch in the early afternoon, just the two of them ahead of the herd, and they looked at the ground together. "How bad?" she said. "I've seen it worse," Hatch said. "I've seen it better." "Will the footing hold?" "For the horses, probably. For the cattle." He squinted at the frozen surface. "We take it slow, no pushing." "Can we make Copper Creek in 4 days at a slow pace?" Hatch was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic she couldn't do herself because she didn't know the terrain well enough. "Maybe," he said, "if we don't lose time to falls or breakaways." "And if we do?" He looked at her. "Then we're late to the railhead, and Fitcher has had time to make other arrangements." She absorbed this. "Take it slow," she said. Hatch nodded and went back to position. They took it slow. The ascent occupied the rest of the afternoon, a grinding, careful procession of animals and men up a frozen slope that was not steep enough to be impossible, but steep enough to be unforgiving of mistakes. Tamsin watched from a position halfway up and counted, the way she counted everything. The animals that had come up safely, the ones still below, the ones at the front that were beginning to bunch at the crest. Garrick appeared beside her on horseback. She looked at him. He was still pale, but there was color in his face from the cold and the exertion of getting back on a horse, and his eyes were clear. "You're supposed to be in the wagon," she said. "I can't watch from the wagon," he said. She didn't argue. She pointed at a section of the herd that was beginning to angle wrong, and he was moving before she finished the gesture, which was the thing about Garrick on a horse. Whatever his lungs were doing, the rest of him remembered exactly what to do. They made camp on the rim that night, exposed to the full weight of the April wind, which had nothing to obstruct it at that elevation, and no interest in the concerns of the people in its path. Tamsin sat with her back against a rock, and her coat pulled tight, and the saddlebag with the sourdough crock between her feet, and she felt the cold work its way through every layer she had, and thought about the railhead and Silas Fitcher, and what she was going to say when she got there. She had been thinking about it for weeks. The argument she would make, the leverage she would use, the way she would position it. She had thought about Fitcher's railroad cars and the delayed shipment, and the particular dynamics of a man who has empty cars and a timeline and needs product. She had thought about what 930 cattle, one lot, presented as one sale, could do that no individual rancher could do alone. She had also thought about what Fitcher would do when he saw who he was negotiating with. She had no illusions about that. She knew what a livestock buyer from Harmon City would think when a woman in a trail-worn coat came to sell him cattle. She knew he would look past her for the real decision-maker, and she knew that Garrick being there, even in a supporting role, even sick and diminished, would matter in ways she couldn't entirely circumvent. She had decided she didn't care about the means if the end was right. What she cared about was the outcome. What she cared about was getting $24 a head, or as close to it as she could force, for cattle that Fitcher would otherwise buy at 19. The difference was $5 per animal. The difference was 930 animals. She had done that arithmetic more times than she could count. 4 days after leaving Red Mesa, with one near disaster involving a creek crossing on the third morning that had cost them 3 hours and one of the Collier brothers' horses, they came off the final descent toward Copper Creek in the late afternoon of a day that had been cold and clear. The railhead was visible from the last ridge, the water tower, the station building, the lines of empty cars that caught the flat afternoon light. Tamsin counted the cars from the ridge before they came down. She counted them twice. Then she looked at Hatch. 14 cars, she said. At minimum 40 cattle per car, Hatch said. He needs product, she said. Hatch's expression shifted about a millimeter, which, for Hatch, was the equivalent of a wide smile. Yes, he does, he said. Silas Fitcher was at the station when they arrived. He was not what Tamsin had pictured, which was her own mistake for picturing. She had imagined someone physically imposing, someone who looked the part of a ruthless buyer. What she got instead was a man of medium height in his mid-50s with a neat coat and a neat mustache, and the careful eyes of someone who has spent his life calculating value. He looked at the herd coming off the ridge with those careful eyes, and he looked at Tamsin, and he looked at Garrick, and he looked back at the herd. She saw the flicker of calculation on his face. She had expected it. "Vale," he said, moving toward Garrick. "Fitcher," Garrick said. "You'll want to speak with my wife. She's handling the sale." Fitcher's gaze moved to Tamsin. He adjusted something in his expression. She could see him doing it, could see the mental shift as he recalibrated who he was dealing with. "Mrs. Vale," he said. "Mr. Fitcher," she said, "let's talk about your cars." He looked at the herd again. "How many head?" 930, she said, from 5 operations. Healthy animals, properly counted, with bills of sale ready for everyone. He looked back at her. "I'm prepared to offer—" "Not yet," she said. He stopped. "Before you offer anything," she said, "I want to make sure we understand the situation. You have 14 cars and a schedule and a shipment that's delayed somewhere south of here. I have 930 cattle that represent the only significant supply coming over this rim before the spring drives start. We both know what that means for your timeline." Fitcher was very still. "I know about the Harmon City Junction delay," she said. "I know your cars have been sitting here for 6 days." It was a gamble. She knew it was a gamble. She knew the delay was real because Garrick's foreman had confirmed the information from a rider passing through, but she didn't know how severe it was or how much urgency Fitcher was actually operating under. She was stating it as a certainty because certainty was its own kind of leverage. Fitcher looked at her for a long moment. $19 a head, he said. "No," she said. "It's a fair market price in current conditions." "It's a fair market price if I have no other option," she said. "I have 14 other options standing in your yard. What I don't have is a reason to sell one animal separately from the others." She held his gaze. "All 930, one lot, or none." Fitcher's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. 20, he said. 24, she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's not—" "Mr. Fitcher," she said. "You know what your cars need. You know what your timeline needs. You know what the alternative is, waiting another 2 weeks for the spring drives to come through, by which point your schedule is a problem with people considerably more important than me." She paused. $24 a head, all 930. Or I ride back the way I came and you explain to your railroad contract why your cars went back empty. The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it. Behind her, she could hear the cattle moving, the sound of nearly 1,000 animals existing in their particular noisy way. She could feel Garrick to her left, saying nothing, which was exactly what she'd asked him to do. She could feel Hatch somewhere behind her, and Fenner, and the Collier brothers, and Marsh, all of them waiting. Fitcher looked at the herd. He looked at his cars. He looked at Tamsin. 22, he said. 24, she said. "I'm not moving." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is deciding whether he's been outmaneuvered and how much it matters. "You've done this before," he said. "Negotiated." "No," she said. "But I've watched other people do it badly, and I learned from that." Something moved in his face that was almost respect, though she suspected he didn't know what to do with it. 2350, he said. 24, she said. He took a breath through his nose. He looked at the cattle one more time. $24 a head, he said. All 930, one lot. And the smaller ranchers in this group are paid first, she said, before Red Mesa sees $1. Fitcher stared at her. "That's not standard. It's my condition," she said. "The Fenner operation, the Collier brothers, Mr. Marsh, they're paid first, full amount. Then Red Mesa." Fitcher looked at Garrick. Garrick said nothing. "Why?" Fitcher said to Tamsin. "Because they need it first," she said, "and because I said so." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "God. All right. $24, smaller operations first." She shook his hand. Her hand was steady. She was aware of its steadiness in a way that meant it was an achievement rather than a default. Underneath the steadiness, her body was doing things she wouldn't acknowledge until later, until she was somewhere private enough to let them happen. Garrick spoke, for the first time since the negotiation had started, when Fitcher had walked away to speak to his men. $24, he said. Yes. You said 24 and you didn't move. No. He was quiet. Then, Pete Fenner is going to cry. Pete Fenner is going to deny crying, she said, which is different. The settlement took the better part of the next day because counting and billing 930 cattle is not a quick business. And Fitcher's men were meticulous in the way that men are meticulous when they've just spent more than they wanted to. But the numbers held. The animals were there, the bills of sale were in order, and by late afternoon on the 5th day from Red Mesa, Tamsin had in her hands enough money to stop the bank from taking Garrick's ranch, to clear the Fenner debt, to settle the Collier brothers' loans, and to give Aldous Marsh enough to survive the year and make better decisions next time. Fenner didn't cry. But when she handed him his payment and told him it was his first, before Red Mesa, his throat moved several times and he turned to look at his cattle being loaded, and he was quiet for longer than he usually was. "Thank you," he said finally. "It came out rough." "You brought the cattle," she said. "That's what made it possible." He shook his head. "You know that's not—" "Pete," she said, "take your money. Go home to Ruth." He took the money. He went. The Collier brothers were loud about it, which was their way, and she endured 10 minutes of enthusiastic appreciation from Marcus, while Eli stood beside him grinning, and then they loaded their horses and left for home at a pace that suggested they were in a hurry to tell someone. Marsh was last. He came to her as she was settling the accounts, and he stood with his hat in his hands, which she had not seen him do before. He was usually very careful with his hat, in the way that young men sometimes are with the things that make them feel like the people they're trying to become. "I said things about you," he said, "when you first came to talk to me. Things I said to other people about who you were." She looked at him. "I want you to know I understand now that I was wrong," he said. It was clearly costing him something, the way that admitting things costs young men when their pride is caught up in having been right. "I want you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. He was 26 years old, and he had learned something, which was more than a lot of people managed at twice his age. "I know," she said. "Now go home." He went. Garrick found her by the water tower as the light was failing, standing with her saddlebag open and the sourdough crock in her hands, checking it. It had survived the drive intact, not a crack in it, the starter inside still alive and doing what it did, regardless of the 70 miles and the frozen rim and the negotiations and all the rest of it. "How is it?" he said. "Fine," she said. "It needs feeding." "I'll find you some flour." He paused. "Are you all right?" She looked at the crock. She thought about the money in the envelope in her coat, the specific amount, what it meant, what it was going to do for people who had been 3 weeks away from losing everything. She thought about Fitcher's face when she said 24 and didn't move. She thought about Fenner's throat working. "I'm tired," she said. "That's allowed. I'll be fine when we're home." 2 days, he said. 2 days, she agreed. She wrapped the crock carefully and put it back in the saddlebag and buckled the flap. The light at Copper Creek was going gold at the edges, the last of the April sun catching the side of the water tower and the line of cars that would soon be full and moving east. She had done the thing. She had brought the cattle through and gotten the price and paid the smaller ranchers first, and the math was right, and the people who needed it were going to keep what they'd built. That was the fact of it, plain and real. But there was another piece she had been turning in her mind since before the drive, something she had decided on that she hadn't told Garrick yet, because telling him would make it a conversation, and a conversation would require her to explain it. And she wasn't sure she could explain it in terms he'd fully understand. Some decisions don't come from logic. Some come from a place that's harder to name. She was going to deliver Orson's money herself. Every dollar that was his, the proceeds from his cattle that she had folded into the combined herd at his instruction, which he had given grudgingly through an intermediary when the math of the combined drive became too obvious to ignore, was coming back to him through her hands. She could have had Garrick do it. She could have had Hatch do it. There was no practical reason it needed to be her. But Orson had told her nobody would take her in. He had told her she had nowhere to go, and nobody who would want her and no future that wasn't his kitchen floor. He had held her labor for 11 years like a debt he was owed rather than a gift she was giving. He had spread the story of her past with the particular satisfaction of someone who understood that keeping another person small requires regular maintenance. She was going to bring him his money. Every cent that was his. She was going to do it because the alternative, keeping it, or having someone else handle it, or making him come to her, was the kind of answer that said something about her, and she was particular about what she said with her actions. She was going to look him in the eye and give him what was his and say nothing about the rest of it, because the nothing was its own kind of statement, and it was the one she'd chosen. She put her hand on the saddlebag and felt the shape of the crock under the leather, the familiar roundness of it. The starter was alive, the drive was done. The money was in her coat, she was going home. The ride back from Copper Creek took 2 days, and Tamsin spent most of both of them inside her own head. The herd was gone, loaded onto Fitcher's 14 cars and headed east before the second morning. And without the cattle, the return journey had a different quality, lighter and faster and quieter, in the way that empty space is always quieter than full. The men rode in loose formation, talking more than they had on the way out, the particular release of people who have done a hard thing and come out the other side of it. Fenner rode near the front and didn't say much, but the set of his shoulders was different from what it had been crossing the rim 4 days ago. The Collier brothers told the same story about the creek crossing 3 times and found it funnier each time. Marsh rode mostly alone, which was his way, but he nodded at Tamsin when she passed him on the second morning, and the nod had something in it that hadn't been there before. Garrick rode beside her when the trail allowed it, which wasn't always. His cough was better. The cold, dry air of the return trip seemed to suit him more than the damp of the drive out, or maybe the relief of the outcome was doing something for him that medicine couldn't. He didn't talk much, but he was present in a way that she had come to recognize as his particular form of attentiveness, the way he positioned his horse close enough that she wasn't riding alone even when they weren't speaking. She was thinking about Orson. She had told Garrick her intention the previous night, at the small camp they'd made in the shelter of a rock outcropping halfway down from the rim. She had said it plainly, the way she always said things, and watched his face while she said it. He had been quiet for a moment, then, "You don't have to do that yourself." "I know. I can send Hatch." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. He had learned, over 4 months of marriage, to hear the things she didn't say as clearly as the things she did. "You've made up your mind," he said. "Yes." "Is this about proving something?" She considered the question honestly, because it deserved honesty. "Partly," she said, "but not to him, to myself." He didn't try to talk her out of it. That was the thing about Garrick. Once he understood why a person needed to do something, he generally got out of the way and let them do it. It was one of the things she had come to rely on in ways she hadn't expected to rely on anything. They parted ways with Fenner and the Collier brothers at the split in the road 8 miles west of Ironwill Basin, and with Marsh shortly after at his own turnoff. Tamsin watched them go, Fenner with a raised hand that was his version of gratitude, the Colliers' voices carrying back down the road for a full quarter mile. She watched until the road was quiet again, and then she turned her horse east. Orson's ranch was 3 miles in the direction she didn't usually go anymore. She had not been back to her cousin's property since the December morning she'd loaded her bags into the wagon and driven away without turning around. 4.5 months. She had heard about Orson occasionally, from the network of information that moves through a small community without anyone organizing it. But she hadn't sought the information out, and she hadn't thought about him often. She had been too busy. She had been too fully occupied with the business of her own life to spend time in the rooms of the old one. But she thought about him now, riding east on a road she used to know as the only road home. She thought about the 11 years. Not the whole of them at once, because 11 years is too much to hold in a single thought, but specific things, specific moments that had settled into her somewhere and stayed. The morning she'd asked for payment and he'd looked at her like she was furniture that had malfunctioned. The way he'd told her nobody would want her, with that particular satisfaction that some people carry in having predicted another person's failure. The spreading of the stories about her past, the quiet poisoning of whatever chance she'd had at a different reputation in this valley, which she had always suspected but had never been able to prove, and had eventually decided it didn't matter whether she could prove it. She was not going to his door with any of that in her hands. She had decided that before she'd told Garrick, before the drive, maybe before the cattle negotiation, she had decided it somewhere in the long hours of quarantine management and bread production and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from holding too many things at once. She had arrived at a kind of clarity about Orson that was not forgiveness exactly,
because she didn't believe in packaging things up neatly and calling them forgiven. It was something different.
More like she understood now what he was and what he wasn't, and she had stopped expecting from him things that weren't in his nature to give. And the stopping of that expectation had released something in her that she hadn't known was clenched. He had treated her as labor. He had protected himself at her expense when it cost him nothing to do so. He was not a monster. She was careful about that, careful not to make him larger or more dramatically villainous than he actually was, because the reality was both simpler and in some ways worse. He was just a man who had never found a reason to treat her well when treating her badly was easier. She was going to give him his money, and she was going to leave, and whatever he did with both was his business. Garrick had ridden with her as far as the split and then pulled up. She had looked at him. "You don't need to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll wait at the road." "Garrick, I'm not coming in," he said. "I'll wait at the road." His voice was entirely level. "That's what I'm doing." She had looked at him for a moment, at the quiet certainty of his face, the way he had positioned himself so that she knew exactly where he'd be when she came back. And something had moved through her that she didn't try to name. "All right," she said, "don't get off the horse. Your lungs still sound like gravel." She rode on alone. Orson's yard looked exactly as it had when she left it. This surprised her slightly. She had half expected the place to look different, the way familiar things sometimes look different when you've been away long enough to stop seeing them with adjusted eyes. But it was the same fence that needed painting, the same wagon with the cracked wheel in the same corner, the same kitchen window she had looked out of 10,000 times in 11 years. Orson was in the yard. He saw her coming while she was still on the road, and he stood where he was and watched her ride in, and his face ran through several expressions in the span of a few seconds before settling on something careful and unreadable. She dismounted. She didn't tie the horse. She looped the reins over her arm. She wasn't staying. "Tamsin," he said. "Orson," she said. They looked at each other across a distance of about 10 feet. She had been gone 4.5 months, and she had come back a different person in ways that the same coat and the same face didn't fully communicate, and she could see him registering this without being able to articulate what he was registering. "I heard about the drive," he said. "Then you know why I'm here." He looked at the envelope in her hand. Something moved across his face. Complicated. Quick. "Your cattle went with ours," she said. "You agreed through your man Deacons. 22 animals, at $24 a head." She held out the envelope. $528, minus the proportional cost of the drive, which was $11.40. Your total is $516.60. It's all there. I counted it twice. He stared at the envelope. "I could have kept it," she said. "I want you to know that I understand that. Nobody would have questioned the accounting. You weren't on the drive, you didn't have a man there to watch the count, and you didn't exactly see me off warmly when I left." She paused. "But it's your money. So here it is." He didn't take it immediately. He looked at her face as though trying to find something in it. The catch, the performance, the thing underneath the surface that would explain why she was doing this. "Why?" he said. "Because they were yours," she said. Simple. 4 words. She had decided on those 4 words weeks ago, and she used them now and watched them land. He took the envelope. His hand was not steady. She was about to turn back to her horse when he said, "Tamsin." She waited. He stopped. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the fence that needed painting, the wagon with the cracked wheel, the kitchen window. He looked at everything except her. "I heard about what you did, with the sickness, the deliveries, and the—" He stopped again. His jaw moved. "Some of those people, they were saying your name, like it meant something." She said nothing. "I didn't expect that," he said. "I know," she said. She got back on her horse. She looked at him one more time, at the man who had held her life in one hand for 11 years and called it charity. And she felt something that wasn't triumph and wasn't pity and wasn't the clean, bright satisfaction she'd sometimes imagined she would feel in a moment like this. It was quieter than any of those things. It was the feeling of a door being closed, not locked, not barricaded, just gently and finally closed. "Take care of yourself," she said. She rode back down the road to where Garrick was waiting. He looked at her face when she reached him. He didn't ask how it went. He just fell into pace beside her, and they rode back toward Red Mesa together through the late afternoon light, and after a while she said, "It's done." "Good," he said. "He didn't know what to do with it," she said, "giving it back." "I imagine he didn't. He's going to think about it for a long time," she said. "That's enough." Garrick glanced at her. "Is it?" She thought about that seriously because it deserved serious thought. Whether it was enough. Whether the clean return of his money, without recrimination, without the speeches she could have made, whether that added up to something that satisfied whatever it was in her that had needed resolving. "Yes," she said, "because I did it for me, not for him. That's the difference." They rode the rest of the way home, in the kind of quiet that sits comfortably between people who have been through something together and don't need to explain it to each other. Red Mesa was lit up when they came over the last rise. Lit up the way a house is lit when someone is waiting inside it. Every window showing light, smoke from the kitchen chimney, a lamp on the porch. Tamsin pulled up on the rise for a moment and looked at it. A working ranch at the end of a hard season, nothing grand about it, everything functional, most of it built by hands that had been at it for 20 years before she arrived. It was her house. Not in the sense that her name was on the deed, it wasn't, but in the sense that mattered, the sense that has nothing to do with documents and everything to do with where your body understands it belongs. She rode down the rise and into the yard. Lenora came out of the house before Tamsin had dismounted, which was unusual enough that Tamsin's chest tightened slightly. Lenora came out of the house when something needed doing, not simply to be there, but she came out and stood at the porch rail and watched Tamsin dismount with a look on her face that Tamsin couldn't immediately read. "There are people," Lenora said. "Inside." Tamsin stopped. "They started coming 2 days ago," Lenora said. "Some of the quarantine families. They're out of supplies, and some of them aren't sure the sickness is over, and they—" She paused. "They asked for you." Tamsin looked at the house. Through the window, she could see the shape of people at the kitchen table, at her kitchen table. "How many?" she said. "Right now, 4 families," Lenora said. "Others have come and gone. There were 7 yesterday." She dismounted the rest of the way and handed her reins to a ranch hand who had appeared from the barn. She looked at Garrick. "Go inside and sit down," she told him. "Your lungs are not finished yet." Tamsin, "Garrick." She looked at him steadily. "Inside." He went, which she noted, because he didn't always. She went in through the kitchen door. Her instinct was always the kitchen door, and found the table occupied by 2 women and a man she recognized, and a child she didn't, all of them with the particular look of people who have been through something and are not entirely sure they're through it yet. The man was from the Kettrick household, the family she had ridden to see on the first morning of the quarantine, the ones she had warned about contact with Thomas Weil. His wife was beside him. They both looked like they'd been sleeping badly for 2 weeks, which was probably accurate. "Mrs. Vale," Kettrick said. He stood up when she came in, which felt formal and strange. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what's happening." He sat. He told her. The sickness had passed through his household. 2 of the children had been sick, mild cases, both recovered, but his wife hadn't been able to sleep since it started. And now that the quarantine was theoretically over, she didn't know how to feel safe again, how to know when it was really finished, how to know when it was all right to let the children go out again. Tamsin sat across from them and listened, and then she explained it. The specific markers of recovery, the time frames, the symptoms that would indicate a new case versus residual soreness from the illness. She was not a doctor, and she said so, but she also knew what she had learned 17 years ago in Caddo Flats, and what she had been applying here, and she gave them what she had. The other woman, she didn't know her name, was from a household further east. Her husband had died. Not from diphtheria. From a heart that had been failing for 2 years and had chosen this particular crisis as the moment to stop. But the 2 things had happened simultaneously, and she was sitting in Tamsin's kitchen because there was nowhere else she had felt the pull to go. Tamsin got her coffee and sat with her. She didn't try to find the right words because there are no right words for that kind of loss. And she'd stopped believing in them a long time ago. She just sat. She did what she knew how to do. They stayed for an hour. When they left, Tamsin stood at the kitchen door and watched them go, and Lenora appeared behind her. "There'll be more tomorrow," Lenora said. "Probably," Tamsin said. "I told them to come back. The ones who came when you were gone." She paused. "I hope that was—" "It was right," Tamsin said. Lenora was quiet for a moment. The bread is in the oven, she said. I've been keeping up with it. Tamsin turned and looked at her. Lenora's expression was the careful one she wore when she was saying something that had more weight behind it than the words themselves. She had been managing the bread production alone for 5 days, with Silas doing the starter feedings in the morning, and the households on the delivery route had not gone without. Thank you, Tamsin said. I learned from the best, Lenora said, and it was said so quietly and so without ceremony that it took Tamsin a moment to fully hear it. She didn't make anything of it. She went to the oven and checked the bread. The epidemic was declared over by Dr. Breer in the second week of May. 14 people had died in Ironwill Basin, mostly the elderly and the very young, mostly in the households that had been reached later in the outbreak's progress, mostly in the places where the news hadn't gotten fast enough. 14 was not a small number. Every one of them was specific, a face, a name, a family that would carry the gap of them. Tamsin knew the count, and she carried it, the way you carry the losses you couldn't prevent after you've set down the ones you could. But the doctor's calculation, worked out carefully, with the contact maps in Silas's notebook as part of his evidence, was that without the quarantine system and the supply deliveries and the speed of the initial response, the number would have been closer to 40. He published this calculation in the Ironwill Basin weekly paper in a brief statement, which mentioned Tamsin by name. She read it sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and then set the paper down and went back to work, which was what she always did with information she didn't know what to do with yet. Garrick read it later and left it on the table without saying anything, which was his version of saying something. Silas read it and came to find her in the kitchen. It says you, he said. He had the paper in his hand. He was 12 years old and growing. She had noticed in the past 2 months that he was growing, the particular visible velocity of a child in the year their body decides to move. I know, she said. 30 people fewer might have died, he said, because of what you did. Because of what we did, she said. Your lists, Hatch's riders, your father, Lenora, Dr. Breer, all of it together. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. But you started, he said. She looked at him, at his serious face, his father's eyes, the notebook she'd given him that first morning visible in his shirt pocket because he carried it everywhere now, which she had noticed and not mentioned. Someone had to, she said. I was the one who knew what to look for. He absorbed this. Then, if you hadn't come here, but I did, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you did, he said. It came out the way 12-year-old boys say the things they mean. Slightly too fast, slightly too flat, with their eyes somewhere else. Because the directness of feelings at that age is something you have to approach sideways, or it gets away from you. She looked at the bread she was shaping. She didn't look at him. I know, she said. I am too. He left the kitchen. She stood at the work table and pressed the heel of her hand into the dough and told herself firmly that this was not a moment to fall apart over, that she was a practical woman with practical things to do and a batch of bread that wasn't going to shape itself. She baked for another 20 minutes before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. The story of Tamsin's past broke open in public at the end of May. She hadn't been the one to tell it. She had carried it with her, the way she'd always carried it, present but not displayed, available if asked and not volunteered. But the specific version of her history that the Valley had circulated for 20 years, the version with the vague insinuations and the unstated implications and the careful damage of a story told in the language of almost saying something, had been maintained by the steady pressure of Orson Crowell's contributions to it, and that pressure had stopped when Tamsin stopped being something Orson needed to diminish. What broke it open was Ruth Fenner. Ruth Fenner had delivered her third child in February and survived a quarantine in April, and had spent the previous 20 years living in Ironwill Basin and watching the Valley treat Tamsin Crowell as a cautionary tale, and she had apparently reached the end of her patience with it on a Saturday in May at the dry goods store when a woman whose name Tamsin never learned made a comment about the kind of woman who had been needed for the drive to Copper Creek. Tamsin heard about it secondhand from Fenner himself, who told Garrick, who told Tamsin in the kitchen one evening, with the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain whether the news is good or bad. Ruth said something? Tamsin said. Ruth told the story, Garrick said. Your story, the real one. Cole Prentice, the bigamy, all of it. She apparently told it at considerable volume. Tamsin was quiet. She told it as a corrective, Garrick said. That was the word she used when Pete told me. She said she was correcting the record. She sat with that. She thought about Ruth Fenner, whom she had met twice and both times had impressed her. The practical calm, the nursing baby, the two-word directive to her husband at the kitchen table that first day. Let her finish. She thought about a woman taking it on herself to correct something that wasn't her story to correct, out of what appeared to be simple, furious decency. How did people respond? She said. From what Pete says, well, mixed, Garrick said. Some believed it. Some were... He paused. Some people have decided things about you a long time ago and don't want to be wrong. That's accurate, she said. It's not fair. No, but it's true. She looked at him. Are you going to do something about it? He met her eyes. I already did, he said. She waited. I went to the barber shop this morning, he said. Tomlinson was there, and the two Garvey men, and the Reverend's associate, and I told them the same story Ruth told. I told it from the beginning, and I didn't leave anything out. His voice was level. I also said that I'd been listening to people speak about my wife in ways I intended to stop tolerating, and that I'd notice who kept doing it. She looked at him across the kitchen. Garrick, she said. It needed saying, he said. People will think, I don't care what people think, he said. I care what's true. And the truth is you were wrong 20 years ago, and you've been wronged a little bit every day since, and it's going to stop now, or the people perpetuating it are going to have to explain themselves to me directly. She pressed her mouth together. She breathed through her nose once, steadily. You didn't need to do that for me, she said. I know, he said. I did it because it was right. Those are different things. She turned back to the stove. She stood at the stove with her back to him and adjusted something in the pot that didn't need adjusting. Thank you, she said to the stove. You're welcome, he said to her back. They didn't discuss it further. The community's response to the truth, once it was out, was the kind of messy, uneven, incomplete reckoning that communities are capable of. Which is to say, not the clean vindication of a story, not the dramatic reversal of 20 years of damage, but something smaller and more real. Some people came to Tamsin with something they called an apology, which was in several cases more of a justification wearing an apology's clothes, and she received each one with patience and without helping them feel better about it, because she had decided that was the honest thing to do. Some people avoided her more pointedly than before, which told her something useful about those people. Some people treated her exactly as they had before, which was either a form of acceptance or a form of indifference, and she found she didn't need to know which. What she needed, she already had. It was late June when families began arriving at Red Mesa, not in crisis, but simply to visit. The first was the Kettricks, who came on a Sunday afternoon with a cake Ruth Fenner had made for them to bring, because apparently the Kettrick family didn't bake and knew it. They sat in the front room and drank coffee and talked about ordinary things. The weather, the cattle situation, the state of the road to Copper Creek. And when they left, Mrs. Kettrick pressed Tamsin's hand and said, You come to us if you ever need anything. It was such a simple thing. It was the most ordinary expression of community that exists, the mutual offer of help, the acknowledgement that need moves in both directions. Tamsin had heard it all her life, and it had never been directed at her, and she received it now with the careful steadiness of a person handling something they're afraid to drop. Thank you, she said. Others came. Not all at once, not in any organized way. The valley didn't work like that, didn't arrange its social life into events so much as drift toward the people who had proven themselves useful and real. But they came. The widow whose husband had died during the quarantine crisis came and sat in the kitchen and was not required to be cheerful about it. Aldous Marsh came once to ask her advice about a business arrangement he was considering, which she gave him straightforwardly, including the part where his plan had a significant flaw. He thanked her and went away to fix the flaw, and came back 2 weeks later to tell her he'd fixed it. The sourdough starter had been living on the shelf in her kitchen since she'd brought it back from Copper Creek, fed and tended, producing bread every day for the people of Red Mesa, and increasingly for the people who came through it. The crock had survived the drive without a crack. The starter was as active as it had ever been, maybe more. She'd been feeding it more consistently, with better flour, and it showed. She had been thinking about the dividing for a long time before she did it. The idea had come to her somewhere in the middle of the quarantine, in one of the before-dawn hours when she was the only person awake, and the kitchen was hers alone, and her mind had the space to move. She had been feeding the starter and thinking about what it actually was, biologically and practically, a living thing that required care, that rewarded consistency, that produced something useful indefinitely, as long as someone remembered to tend it. And she had thought about her grandmother, who had carried it west not because she was sentimental, though she was, but because she understood that some things need to keep moving to stay alive. A starter left alone in a jar eventually exhausts itself. It needs to be used, shared, divided. The more you give away, the more you have. She had carried the crock for 20 years as though scarcity made it precious, as though the value of the thing lived in its being kept. She understood now that she'd had it backwards. The value lived in the giving. The first cup went to the widow. She wrapped it in a cloth and carried it over herself on a Wednesday afternoon, with instructions written in her clear, small handwriting about the feeding and the temperature and what to watch for and how to know when it was ready to use. The widow took it the way you take something that's been given with intent, not just accepting the object, but understanding what it represents. "This is from your family?" she said. "It started with my grandmother," Tamsin said. "She carried it west in a wagon. It's been alive longer than either of us." The widow held the crock for a moment. "I'll take care of it," she said. "I know you will," Tamsin said. The second cup went to the Kettricks, the third to a struggling family at the edge of the valley who had come through the quarantine period with their animals and their lives intact, but their food stores nearly depleted. The fourth to a young woman who had married the previous fall and had come to Red Mesa twice asking Tamsin's advice about managing a kitchen, advice Tamsin had given without ceremony or condescension. By late summer, kitchens throughout Ironwill Basin were baking from the same living starter. The bread tasted different in different houses, different flour, different hands, different temperatures, but it came from the same source, the same thread running back through Tamsin's kitchen and her grandmother's wagon and 40 years of careful remembering. She did not give it away expecting anything in return. She gave it away because the holding had started to feel wrong in her hands. Lenora's wedding was in September. She had been courted since the spring by a young man from the northern part of the valley, a rancher's son named David, who had been coming to Red Mesa regularly enough that everyone on the ranch had long since stopped noticing the extra horse in the yard. He was quiet and steady and looked at Lenora with the particular attention of someone who understood they were in the presence of something worth paying attention to, and Tamsin had watched him across several dinners and reached the conclusion that he was probably not going to be a disaster. She had said as much to Garrick. "High praise," he said. "I don't have enough information to say more," she said. "He's been here 6 months. Ask me in 5 years." She had been more careful with her feelings about Lenora's marriage than she had admitted to anyone, including herself. There was a complicated thing in it. The girl's departure, the gap it would leave in the household, the fact that Lenora had come around the long way to something like acceptance and now was going to go, and Tamsin had not realized until it was happening how much she had come to depend on the particular company of Lenora's presence, even when that presence was difficult. The wedding was small. Garrick walked his daughter down the aisle of the Ironwill Basin Community Hall, and Tamsin sat in the front row beside Silas, and Silas sat with his hands folded and his face serious in the way he always was for important things. During the ceremony, Tamsin looked at Lenora and saw what she saw. A young woman who had survived her mother's death and a stranger arriving in her house, and a quarantine and a cattle drive, and the long, slow work of learning to trust someone she'd initially hated, and who was now standing at the front of a room looking more herself than she'd looked in the 18 months Tamsin had known her. Not because of Tamsin, she was careful not to claim that, but maybe partly through what Tamsin had been in her life during the time when that mattering had mattered most. When the ceremony was over, Lenora came and stood in front of her. "I want to say something," Lenora said. "All right," Tamsin said. "When you came to the house," Lenora said, "I was—" She stopped. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was how she gathered herself, which Tamsin knew now. "I wanted you to fail. I wanted you to be wrong about everything so that there would still be a place for my mother to have been right." Tamsin waited. "You didn't let me make you into something you weren't," Lenora said. You just kept being what you were, and eventually I ran out of reasons to fight it." She looked at Tamsin directly. Her eyes were bright, but she was not going to cry, which was very Lenora. You didn't try to replace her. I know that now. I knew it earlier than I admitted. She would have liked you, Tamsin said, the way you've become. Your father told me what she said about you, that she thought you'd be formidable. Lenora's mouth pressed together. Did she say that? He did, which means she did. He doesn't invent things. No, Lenora said. He doesn't. They looked at each other across a year and a half of careful navigation and small moments that had added up to something neither of them had planned. Lenora stepped forward and embraced her. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. It was not graceful. Lenora was not a person who did graceful embraces, any more than Tamsin was. It was the kind of embrace that a person gives when they've made a decision about it and have stopped hesitating, which is its own kind of grace. Thank you, Lenora said, for the bread and the recipes and for… She pulled back. She straightened her dress. She looked across the room to where David was talking to Garrick with the expression of a young man trying to hold his own in a conversation with his new father-in-law. For all of it. Go be married, Tamsin said. Lenora smiled, a full one, unguarded, and went. The autumn settled into Red Mesa the way it always did, with the practical urgency of preparation and the particular beauty of a season that doesn't apologize for what it brings. Silas had gone back to sleeping in the house full-time the previous spring and had not returned to his arrangement in the barn, though he still spent long hours there by choice because he liked the horses and they liked him. And there was a difference between choosing to be somewhere and needing to be somewhere that Tamsin understood well enough to respect. He was 13 now. He was growing into the person he was going to be, which was someone who paid close attention and said few unnecessary things and had a practical mind that saw connections and systems. He had started keeping a second notebook, separate from the contact tracing one that was now part of Dr. Breer's records, a personal one, the content of which he had not shared, but which she could see him writing in sometimes in the evenings. One night in October, she came downstairs late and found him at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a lamp turned up beside him. He looked up. He wasn't embarrassed, which was its own development. There had been a time when she would have caught him at something like that, and he would have been defensive about it. Couldn't sleep, he said. Me neither, she said. Move over. He moved. She sat beside him and didn't look at the notebook. She got up and put the kettle on and made 2 cups of something hot, and sat back down, and they were quiet together in the kitchen, which was a thing they had learned to do without it needing to be more than it was. Tamsin, he said. Did you know it would work? The drive. When you first thought of it. She considered the question. I thought it could work, she said. That's different from knowing. What if it hadn't? Then we would have figured out what to do next, she said. That's all you can do. You make the best decision with what you have, and then you see what happens, and then you make the next decision. He was quiet. Were you scared? Of what specifically? Of being wrong, he said, in front of everyone, after they'd trusted you. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She thought about the moment at the Copper Creek railhead when Fitcher had said 22 and she'd said 24 and held it, and the 3 seconds that had followed, and the particular quality of those 3 seconds. Yes, she said. Very. But you didn't show it. There was no point in showing it, she said. It wouldn't have helped anyone. The fear was mine to manage, not theirs to know about. He thought about this. She could see him filing it somewhere, the way he filed things. Is that something you learned, he said, or something you were always able to do? She looked at him. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know, not because he was making conversation, and she respected the question enough to answer it carefully. I learned it, she said, the hard way. When you spend a long time having no one to rely on but yourself, you figure out which of your feelings you need to act on and which ones you just need to live with. He nodded slowly. Then, you have people now, he said, to rely on. She looked at him. I know it took a while, he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, which was still his way for the important things. I know I wasn't easy when you first came. You were grieving, she said. I was, he agreed. But I saw you working, the quarantine and the drive and all of it, and I kept thinking that you were doing all of it for people who hadn't been particularly… He stopped. started again. You did it for everyone, even the people who didn't deserve it. Most people deserve more than they get, she said. That's been my experience. He looked up at her then. Including you, he said. She held his gaze. The lamp between them was steady, and the kitchen around them was everything she had learned to keep and everything she had learned to give away. And the boy across the table was not small anymore and had been watching her for a year and a half with his father's serious eyes and had apparently understood things she hadn't said. Including me, she said. For a long time. Not anymore, he said. It was not a question. She thought about Garrick upstairs sleeping, his lungs finally clear, his cough finally gone, and about Lenora married and beginning her own life, and about the starter dividing itself into kitchens across the valley, and about the widow who had taken a cup of it and would tend it carefully, and about Orson with his envelope and his silence and the door she had closed, not with anger, but with completion. She thought about what it meant to be seen, really seen, not the version other people had decided on, not the story they told to fill in what they didn't bother to find out, but the actual thing, the actual person, in the actual kitchen, doing the actual work. Not anymore, she said. They sat in the kitchen until the lamp burned low. Then Silas went upstairs and Tamsin stayed a few minutes longer, and she fed the sourdough starter in the early dark the way she always did, the way her mother had, the way her grandmother had before that. She thought about what it cost to keep something alive. Not just the feeding, the showing up, the remembering, the choosing it over and over again in the small, ordinary moments when it would be easier not to. She thought about all the things she had kept alive over the years by that same method, her dignity, her capability, her refusal to become what other people needed her to be. She had done it without an audience. She had done it because there was no one else to do it for her, and it needed doing. The starter bubbled in its crock, active and ready. She covered it and set it back on the shelf. Outside, the October wind moved over Ironwill Basin with the clean, cold authority of a season that knows what it is. The horses shifted in the paddock. The lamp in the upstairs window was still on, which meant Garrick was reading, which he did when he couldn't sleep, which was often. She went upstairs. He looked up when she came in, over the top of the book. He had his glasses on, which he wore only in private, and had been mildly embarrassed about until she had told him, once, without ceremony, to stop being ridiculous about it. He had stopped being ridiculous about it. You were downstairs a long time, he said. Talking to Silas, she said. Something moved in his face, the particular warmth that appeared there when his children were mentioned in a certain way. Good talk? Yes, she said. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. The room was warm. The lamp was low. From downstairs, the house had settled into the sounds it made when everyone was in and accounted for. The small creaks, the familiar rhythm of it. Tamsin, Garrick said. She looked at him. I know I've said this before, he said, but I want you to know I understand how this could have gone. What you walked into when you came here. The children, the valley, all of it. He paused. You didn't have to become what you became in this place. Most people wouldn't have. She looked at her boots in her hand. I didn't do it to become something, she said. I did it because it needed doing. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She set the boots down. She looked at him, at the man who had stood in the street with his hat in his hands and asked her where everyone could hear, who had stood beside her through the quarantine and the drive and the 20 years of stories she hadn't deserved, who had said the honest version of his proposal and meant every word of it. She had been wrong about what she was walking into. She had thought she was walking into a practical arrangement, a decent life, something manageable. She had not thought she was walking into something that would require her to be fully herself in ways she hadn't been in 20 years, that would crack her open in the particular way that good things crack you open and ask you to be bigger than you thought you were. She had not thought she was walking into love, not the kind that asks things of you, not the kind that sees you. She had been wrong. Go to sleep, she said. You first, he said. She lay down. He put the book down and turned out the lamp, and the dark settled around them with the weight of everything they'd survived together, and after a while she could hear his breathing slow toward sleep. She lay awake a little longer. She thought about the crock on the shelf downstairs, covered and resting and alive. She thought about all the other crocks in all the other kitchens across Ironwill Basin, each one a piece of what she had carried for 20 years, and finally understood she was carrying wrong. She had spent her life protecting what she loved by keeping it close, by covering it, by making sure it could not be taken. She had not understood, until now, until this house, until these people, that the keeping and the protecting were sometimes the same as the losing. You had to give it away to find out what it really was. You had to open your hands. The thing about a living starter is this: it doesn't diminish when you divide it. You take a cup from the crock and you give it to a neighbor, and the neighbor begins her own, and the one in your crock keeps growing because that is what living things do when they are well tended and given room. The giving doesn't take anything from you. The giving is what keeps it alive. She had guarded herself for 20 years. She had guarded the truth of who she was, and the truth of what she deserved, and the truth of her own capability, kept it covered and close, because the world had shown her enough times what happened when you left those things unprotected. And then she had walked into a kitchen in February with her bags and her crock, and she had made a decision, not a dramatic one, not even a fully conscious one at first, to stop guarding quite so hard, to let the people in this house see who she actually was and let what happened happen, to be present in her own life in a way she hadn't been in a very long time. What happened was this: the valley still talked, some of it. Orson still carried his resentment, quieter now, but she was not in it anymore. There would be more hard winters and more crises and more moments where she would have to decide whether to trust people who might not deserve it. She would make mistakes. She had made them already, would make more. She was not the person in a story who arrives at the end already completed, but she was known now, really known. And she had people she knew in return, which turned out to be its own kind of survival, not the solitary, defended kind she had practiced for 20 years, but the kind that requires you to remain visible, which is harder and more fragile, and which she was, for the first time in a very long time, no longer afraid to try. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved over Ironwill Basin and the horses stood quiet in the dark, and in a house with lights in every window, a woman who had stopped hoping let herself finally rest.